Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Dreamland Encounters. Here on this channel, I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. Our town got its first drive-in theater that summer of 1957, built on an empty stretch of land at the county's edge, just a gravel lot with a giant white screen against the tree-line. People streamed in from everywhere, farm families in pickups, kids piling into Fords and Chevys, young couples seeking a bit of privacy. My friend Ray and I went during the theater's second weekend. He drove an old Plymouth sedan, roomy enough to stretch out in, and swore the little window-mounted speaker boxes delivered better sound than any radio. The night was warm and still, the kind of heavy air that made your shirt cling to your skin. Forbidden Planet was playing, a flashy modern film that felt like a big event for our small town. The gravel lot was almost full when we arrived. Kids darted between cars, clutching paper bags of popcorn, while parents honked to keep them in check. We parked midway back, positioned just right to see the screen clearly. Ray headed to the snack stand while I watched cars rolling in, headlight beams cutting through dust. That's when I spotted him. A black Mercury coupe sat alone in the far corner, separated from the other vehicles. The driver sat perfectly still, hands on the wheel, staring straight ahead. Unlike everyone else chatting and adjusting speakers, this man remained motionless. Something about his rigid posture felt off. Ray returned with sodas and popcorn, but I didn't mention the strange driver right away. I kept stealing glances in his direction. Even as the cartoon previews flickered to life, the man didn't move an inch. Something was different about him, though I couldn't quite explain what. A little after 9:09, the opening credits began to roll, and that's when everything changed. The lights caught my eye first, a line of 6 or 7 orbs gliding silently overhead. They weren't like plain lights. No blinking, no sound, just a perfect line of glowing spheres, drifting smoothly, as if following an invisible path. What struck me most was the complete lack of reaction. Hundreds of people surrounded me, kids sipping sodas, teenagers laughing, and not a single person looked up, except one. The man in the Mercury had his face turned skyward the moment the lights appeared. His expression was unreadable from my position, but there was something deliberate about his gaze. He didn't seem surprised. It was almost as if he had been expecting me. I nudged Ree, whispering urgently for him to look. He glanced around, confused, then shrugged and continued eating popcorn. "What are you talking about?" he asked. The lights continued their silent journey, bright as lanterns, yet he saw nothing. By the time they drifted past the tree-line and vanished into the distance, my hands were damp from gripping the soda bottle. Leaning out my window, I watched the Mercury. The man remained perfectly still, lowering his gaze back to the screen as if nothing unusual had occurred. The movie continued. Laughter, honking horns, and the smell of buttered popcorn filled the air. Everything seemed normal, except for me and that man in the corner. I tried to focus on the film, but something felt off. Each time the projector's light swept across the lot, I'd catch a glimpse of his profile, sharp and pale, unchanging. Halfway through the movie, I noticed he hadn't touched the speaker box. No sound came from his car. He wasn't watching like everyone else. Instead, his eyes would occasionally drift upward to the empty sky above the screen, as if anticipating something more. As the show neared its end, and people started their engines early, Rai leaned over and asked about grabbing a burger. I agreed, though my stomach was in knots. The mystery of the lights and the man in the Mercury lingered, unresolved. Cars rolled out in long lines towards the exit road, horns honking and dust hanging low across the headlights. I scanned the corner one last time. The Mercury was gone. No engine noise, no headlights moving through the lot. I tried to convince myself he must have slipped out during the end-of-night commotion, but I hadn't seen him leave, and I'd been watching closely. Rai chattered beside me, laughing and doing a robot impression from the movie. I nodded, barely hearing it. Cool night air rushed through the open window as we passed the county road, drive-in lights still visible behind us. I caught myself scanning the sky, half expecting those orbs to reappear. I never mentioned the man in the Mercury to Rai. He wouldn't have believed me, especially since he hadn't seen the lights. But I remembered that man's face, steady, almost calm, as if the rest of us were mere background noise, while something more significant unfolded above. Throughout that summer, I returned to the drive-in several times. I watched westerns, comedies, even a horror picture. The Mercury never reappeared. Sometimes I'd park near the back row, checking the corners, but they always remained empty. Those strange lights never returned either. Yet I could still picture those glowing orbs sliding soundlessly over the lot, and the man watching them with such quiet anticipation, like this wasn't a surprise, but a meeting he'd been expecting all along. In 1952, walking home from school in a small western Kansas town, I first noticed the chalk drawings. Initially, I thought they were just a child's doodle or some game, but they were strange, sharp angles, forming something like a broken circle, with little lines radiating outward. I paused, studied them, then continued walking. By the next day, more drawings had appeared on sidewalks near the tracks. Curious, I asked classmates about them. Nobody knew their origin. Clara Urra J. Ensign, a classmate, casually mentioned, "The man by the tracks showed me." She said it so matter-of-factly. When I pressed her for details, she simply shrugged and stared at her shoes. The tracks just past the old grain elevator weren't far from town. No trains had run on them for years. I'd been hearing about the man by the tracks for years, but I didn't pay much attention at first. Then the drawings started appearing everywhere. They showed up near the train tracks, by the corner store, in front of the school, and even on my own street. Every kid I talked to knew something about this mysterious figure. Nobody could describe him clearly. Some mentioned a long coat, others talked about a hat pulled low, but no one could recall a face. One evening, I decided to stay out later than usual, hoping to catch a glimpse of this elusive man myself. The town was eerily silent. Street lamps cast weak circles of light that barely reached beyond their posts. A dry, dusty wind blew from the fields. As I approached the tracks, something felt off. I saw the grain elevator, the tracks, and some chalk symbols on the ground. Then I noticed a shadow, tall and thin. It stood perfectly still just beyond the lamp's reach. I froze. The wind whistled through nearby leaves, but the shadow didn't move, not even a slight sway. When I blinked, it seemed to have shifted position. Suddenly, nothing looked familiar. The next day at school, more chalk drawings had appeared, the same symbol repeated over and over. What struck me most was that the kids drawing them didn't seem to remember doing it. I asked Tommy Harper about a drawing he'd made, and he looked confused. "I didn't do that," he said. "I was inside, but I had seen the fresh drawing with my own eyes." Over the next week, I watched the kids closely. They would sometimes stop mid-step, staring toward the tracks at nothing. I saw Clark Raj Jensen holding her chalk, looking at something invisible. Then she'd start drawing the symbol repeatedly, silent and focused. When I asked her what she saw, she just whispered, "He comes by the tracks." It became impossible to ignore after I saw the symbol myself. One afternoon, walking home past the grain elevator. The chalk was fresh, waiting. I kept noticing strange things around the abandoned train tracks. Small sounds like whispers and scratches would stop when I turned my head. At night, odd lights hovered low over the ground, moving slowly along the rails. These weren't normal lamps. They seemed to float and drift, and I couldn't explain them. One evening, I decided I would try to see who or what was causing these strange occurrences. Walking past the grain elevator with wind stinging my ears, the lights appeared again. I held my breath, moving carefully. At the spot where a mysterious chalk symbol had first appeared, I saw a figure, tall and straight, wearing a dark coat against the fading sunlight. He stood just past the tracks. His head was slightly tilted as if studying something. I wanted to call out, but my throat tightened. When I tried to step closer, the lights flickered almost bashfully. Then suddenly, he was gone. Not walking away, not turning around, just vanishing like someone had erased him from the air. The next morning, more chalk symbols appeared on sidewalks closer to the houses. I asked my mother about them. She claimed children were playing, but I knew she was lying. I could tell she had seen something, too. After that, I spent countless nights watching and listening. Faint whispers along the tracks haunted me. Shapes would move slowly, just beyond the lamplight, deliberate, careful, always just out of reach. The chalk symbol kept appearing, seemingly marking a path to somewhere unknown. One afternoon, I saw Clara and Tommy walking on toward the tracks. They weren't speaking, just staring ahead. From a distance, I watched them stop, bend down, and trace the symbol into the dirt with sticks. Then they walked away as if nothing had happened. When I touched the ground where they'd drawn, there was no chalk, no trace at all. Weeks later, my father returned from town with a story from the local bar. The older men had been talking, and one claimed he'd seen something unusual. I was on duty at the Old Point Lighthouse in 1953, working the midnight to dawn shift. The fog had rolled in thick that evening, smothering the coast, and the beam from the lighthouse cut through it like a knife. I'd been at the station for 5 years by then, seen plenty of storms and rough seas, but nothing like what happened that night. In the years that followed, the strange occurrences became a whispered story among local kids. They would draw symbols in chalk, talk about strange lights near the tracks that moved against the wind, almost as if alive. Someone claimed to have found mysterious etched symbols near the elevator that vanished by morning. I kept quiet, not wanting anyone to think I'd lost my mind. Over time, the chalk drawings became less frequent. Children still mentioned the man by the tracks, but the obsessive symbol drawing tapered off. I continued walking past those tracks, unable to stop myself. The wind would sometimes carry a sense of being watched, and I'd catch a glimpse of a silent figure at the edge of my vision. The tracks always appeared empty, but I could feel a presence. Faint lights would hover low over the rails, moving slowly and disappearing when you blink. I started leaving chalk near the sidewalks, hoping to catch whatever was creating these symbols. Each morning, the chalk would be gone, drawn into the mysterious pattern, but I never witnessed how it happened. The next year, my father got TA job elsewhere, and we moved away. Before leaving, I walked the tracks one final time. The chalk symbol remained faint but clear. I traced its lines with my fingers. Nothing happened. No lights, no whispers, just dry wind and dust. Decades later, I returned. The town had transformed houses, moved or demolished. The grain elevator gone. I walked past the tracks. Nothing remained. No chalk, no figure, no lights, just an empty trackpad cutting through the fields. But I know it was real. The children weren't imagining things. Even now the symbol haunts me, sharp angles, a broken circle, lines radiating outward. Sometimes I dream of it floating over the rails at night. And if I ever hear that faint scratch of chalk or see a shadow at the edge of my vision, I still pause just in case the man by the tracks has returned. A glint caught my eye, a reflection right at the edge of my light beam. I paused, wondering if it might be a floating barrel or piece of driftwood, but the shine was too steady, too solid. No ships were scheduled that night. The afternoon shipping logs had confirmed nothing would pass until morning. Grabbing my binoculars, I focused on the glint. What I saw wasn't a ship or a boy, but something massive hovering just above the water. Its shape was vaguely triangular, but with edges unlike any metal plating. Instead, they seemed soft, almost carved from shadows. No lights, no running signals, no smokestack, just a dark outline against the grey fog. I lowered the binoculars, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. It hadn't moved. Checking the horizon, I saw no fog bank that could support such an object. For several minutes, I watched. Each time my beam swept across, the reflection would briefly flare and then vanish. I tried convincing myself it was just a lighthouse reflection bouncing off a wave, but the image remained even when the water beneath was dark. My hand hovered over the radio transmitter. What would I say? Something big and black is hovering off the coast. I set it down. The last thing I wanted was to sound crazy. Stepping onto the balcony, wind whipping around me, I noticed something else. A faint, low hum. More a vibration through the air than an actual sound. I checked the lighthouse machinery. The generator was steady, lamps fine, foghorn idle. Yet the hum was definitely coming from the direction of that shape. Keeping the binoculars trained, I watched. Slowly, it began to drift closer. Or was I imagining it? It didn't slice through the fog like a boat. Instead, it moved as if part of the fog itself, sliding along seamlessly. My stomach sank. I knew how currents could shift, how fog could deceive, but I saw clear breaks in the mist where it passed. This had mass. Something solid and enormous was out there. Glancing at the water, I saw no signs of waves or a bow pushing through. The surface remained calm, almost unnaturally still around this mysterious presence. First, I noticed how the fog changed when my flashlight beam hit it. A dark shadow formed where the light couldn't reach, while the rest of the fog glowed brightly. As I carefully swept the beam around, the shadow stayed perfectly aligned with the shape. This wasn't some optical illusion. Something felt off about the horizon. The ocean's edge seemed closer than it should be, and my eyes kept darting between the mysterious shape and the distant lighthouse keeper's house. Time seemed to stretch and warp. Had I been watching for 20 minutes or an hour? I couldn't tell. The silence was eerie. No engines, no bird calls, not even the usual fog. Just a constant, unbroken hum. I thought about walking down to the dock for a closer look, but the idea of navigating slick, dark rocks made my heart race, so I stayed put, gripping the railing, my binoculars pressed tight against my eyes. Then something strange happened. The reflection disappeared. When my light beam hit the shape, it no longer flickered back. Instead, it seemed to absorb the light completely. The air grew heavy, and I realized my hands were shaking. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Exhaustion, isolation. The fog and darkness could play tricks, but the outline was undeniable. This was massive, larger than any ship I'd ever encountered, and it was hovering impossibly above the water. It didn't belong anywhere. Through my binoculars, I could make out nothing, just a dark, hulking mass floating silently. Then it moved. Not quickly, but just enough. For a brief moment, I could have sworn it tilted, almost as if studying me. When I blinked, it straightened again. The realization that I was alone, that no one else would witness this, sent a chill down my spine. I don't know how long I stood there, transfixed. The wind grew colder, cutting through my clothes, but I couldn't look away. The shape crept closer, still silent, still suspended. Eventually, I dragged myself inside. I closed the door, checked the locks, and kept watching, unable to shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. I was running the midnight shift along Highway 66 in the summer of 1953. My patrol car hummed across the desert like it was part of the quiet itself. Hours of solitude stretched before me, with just the engine's steady rhythm and distant coyote howls breaking the silence. The stars seemed closer that night, brighter than usual, spread across the black sky in a way that made the desert feel smaller somehow. About halfway between Kingman and Seligman, a car caught my eye, pulled over on the shoulder, no headlights, engine lightly dead, sitting there like an abandoned shell. I approached slowly, flashing my lights briefly. It was a dark Greyside in 1950 Plymouth, an older model that looked out of place in the vast emptiness. Stepping out into the warm sand, the asphalt's heat clinging to my shoes, I walked toward the driver's side. A man sat inside, hands gripping the wheel, staring straight up at the sky. "Everything all right, sir?" I called out. No response. His stillness was unlike anything I'd seen before. People freeze in shock, but this was different. His eyes were fixed upward, not like someone squinting at something, but locked in an unnatural, intense gaze. Years later, I'd find myself remembering another strange encounter over water. Binoculars trained through a window, a dark shape hovering above the waves. By dawn, the fog had thinned and everything looked normal. No disturbance in the water, no wreckage, nothing. I called the Coast Guard, claiming it was just a false alarm. Maybe a fishing buoy. I never mentioned it to anyone. Not Clara Ara, not the neighbors. I told myself I had imagined it, though I couldn't explain the shadows, the reflection, or the strange hump. Some nights I still wake to the memory of that dark shape, silent and immense. I catch myself staring out over the water, expecting to see it again, but it never returned. Whatever it was, it didn't belong to any ship, plane, or storm. Just something different out there, waiting for no one in particular. And that night on Highway 66, with that motionless driver, I knew I was witnessing something I couldn't explain, something beyond ordinary understanding. The desert stretched out silent and empty around us. I was on patrol when I noticed something odd about the car. Its driver frozen, staring upward. The stars above weren't behaving normally. They moved in slow, deliberate circles, like an invisible hand was gently rotating them around a hidden center point. I tapped on the window. No response. The D River didn't even flinch, just kept his gaze locked on the sky. The engine was dead, and an unusual quiet hung in the air. No crickets, no night birds, just a strange humming from the landscape itself. Circling to the passenger side, I checked the interior. Everything looked normal, but something felt different. The air seemed thicker, almost vibrating with an unexplained tension. When I touched the door handle, it was warm, not hot like sun-baked metal, but somehow unreal. The stars continued their slow, methodical rotation. I tried convincing myself it was a hallucination, pacing and rubbing my eyes, but the celestial pattern remained unchanged. My hand instinctively moved near my service revolver as I opened the door. The driver sat motionless. When I touched his shoulder, he was shockingly cold. His eyes remained fixed on the sky, seemingly reflecting something white and faintly glowing. Not a star, something else entirely. My mind raced through explanations. Heat stroke, gas leak, anything rational. But nothing made sense. No unusual smells, no signs of disturbance, just the quiet desert, those moving stars, and this unresponsive man. I noticed the headlights were subtly angled upward, not straight ahead, just a slight tilt, but unmistakable. Something was definitely not right. The night was quiet, interrupted only by the static of my radio as I tried desperately to call for backup. No matter how I adjusted the knobs or checked the frequency, nothing but white noise came through. My pulse raced as I looked at the car, its posture seeming as curious as the man inside. I couldn't just leave him there. Approaching carefully, I tried to open the door wider and lift his hands from the steering wheel. That's when I saw his eyes, pupils enormous, dark and glistening, almost consuming the entire eye. Startled, I stepped back. The stars above began to move, spiraling slowly in a mesmerizing, terrifying dance. Time seemed to stretch and warp. I'm not sure how long I stood transfixed. Minutes, maybe longer. Then, with an almost imperceptible blink, the man slumped forward. I shook him, urging him to wake up. He gasped, disoriented and sweaty, mumbling about seeing something. "Stars moving like they were alive," he said, his voice trembling. I listened, but didn't share what I had witnessed. Not wanting to seem crazy, I helped him start the car. The engine sputtered to life, and he drove off slowly onto the highway. I remained behind, staring at the spot where the car had been. The stars now looked normal, just pinpricks of light in the black sky. Driving east, I tried to push the strange scene from my mind, but the man's eyes and the spiraling stars lingered. The next day during my shift, I returned to the location. Nothing seemed out of place. Wind had shifted the desert sand, partially erasing the tire tracks. I discreetly asked around Kingman and Seligman. No reports of anything unusual. The man vanished. Not in hospital logs, not in police records. I kept the story to myself. At the station, among friends, such a tale would invite ridicule. Years later, I've shared the story with a few people. They smile politely, assuming I'm joking. But I know what I saw that night. I was driving my family home that night. A narrow stretch of road just outside of Plainfield, New Hampshire. The air was cold, and a thin fog had settled over the pines that bordered the road, making the beams from our headlights dull and yellowish. My wife Claire sat in the passenger seat, and the kids Timmy and Sally were half asleep in the back. I'd driven this route countless times, but something felt different that night. The fog seemed to thicken around us more than usual, creating an unnatural slowness. As I rounded a bend, 2 bright point TS of light appeared in the distance, perfectly aligned and coming straight toward us. At first, I thought it was another car, but something didn't feel right. The lights didn't behave like typical headlights. They remained exactly level, unwavering. My instinct was to slow down and pull over. Claire muttered, "Someone's coming," in her low, nervous voice. As the lights drew closer, an eerie silence surrounded us. No engine sound, no tires crunching on gravel, just 2 steady spots of brightness, staring like unblinking eyes. I eased our Plymouth to the side of the road. The kid stirred slightly, with Timmy asking if we were stopping for someone. I told him, "Yes, just a minute." Then, the truly strange part happened. The lights didn't just approach. They lifted not like a car going over a hill, but literally rose from the road, drifting upward silently, almost lazily, as if buoyant or floating on an invisible current. Claire gasped. I remember that night exactly. The heat, the stillness, the way the air felt heavy, the man in the Plymouth frozen and staring, stars moving in slow, deliberate circles above us. I can't explain what happened or why, but I know what I saw. Something was there in the desert that night, something that made the air hum, stretched time, and left a man staring at the sky in fear and awe. I drive that stretch of Highway 66 occasionally, usually during the day, sometimes at night if work calls me out. I've never seen it again, and I hope I never do, but every time I look up at the stars, a part of me still checks to see if they've started moving. It's the kind of experience that doesn't leave you, no matter how much you want it to. The fog pressed against the car windows like something alive. I gripped the wheel tightly, trying to keep my hands steady as we drove through the thick darkness. Claire clutched her coat around her shoulders. In the back seat, Timmy and Sally sat wide-eyed. 2 points of light had appeared earlier, floating high above the treetops and drifting slowly eastward into the forest's darkness. I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it. My foot hovered over the brake, frozen in place. "Did you see that?" Claire finally asked. I just nodded, unable to speak. We continued driving more slowly now. The kids kept asking if what we'd seen was a plane or helicopter. I told them I didn't know, carefully avoiding mentioning the strange lights that had moved without any mechanical sound or sense of gravity. About 15 minutes later, something caught my eye near the old Cedar Brook Bridge, a movement in the trees that didn't match the natural sway of branches. Between the trees, I glimpsed a figure, maybe 4 feet tall, standing perfectly still. It seemed to be watching us. "Dad," Sally whispered from the back. "Why is it dark over there?" "Nothing, honey," I responded, my voice sounding hollow, even to my own ears. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving alongside us, just beyond sight. The rest of the drive felt endless. Occasional flickering lights caught my eye, too quick for fireflies, too bright for stars. I scanned the road for animals, but found nothing. Just fog, dark trees, and an unsettling sense of being observed. As we reached the edge of town, the fog thinned. Ordinary house lights appeared, and the kids grew quiet. Claire looked pale, but was trying to stay calm. I was simply relieved to see street lamps again. I parked in front of our house and sat motionless, staring at the black road, disappearing into the trees. Later that night, sleep eluded me. The sounds of that mysterious road echoed in my mind, a haunting reminder of our strange journey. Around midnight, I went back outside to check the road. The scene was eerily quiet, just an empty stretch of road, ice glinting under the moonlight, and occasional owl calls from the pine trees. No tracks, no footprints, nothing to explain what I'd seen early. The next day, I returned to the spot where we pulled over. Our Plymouth's tire marks were visible on the gravel, but no trace suggested any other vehicle had been there. I walked nearly a mile along the roadside, searching for any sign, footprints, broken branches. The trees remained completely untouched. I asked a neighbor if they'd noticed anything unusual the previous night. They hadn't. No strange lights, no reports of missing time. I wondered if I'd imagined it, but I knew I hadn't. Claire had seen it too, and she wasn't someone who got spooked easily. A week later, driving past the same road, a sense of dread settled in my stomach. Fog rolled in, thicker than before. As I slowed down, I caught a fleeting glimpse of something moving at the tree line, a shimmer like a reflection or a ripple. My heart raced, but when I looked directly, nothing was there. I still can't explain what happened. Two lights rising silently from the ground, drifting into the sky, and that brief movement among the trees. I've returned to that road countless times, day and night, in clear weather and fog, but it never repeated. Yet, every time I pass that stretch, I feel watched, something just beyond my perception. Some dismiss it as a trick of light and fog, but I know what I saw. The strangest part wasn't any sense of threat. No roar, no danger, no pain, just a presence moving in impossible ways. I can't rationalize it, and that uncertainty haunts me. Claire says I shouldn't obsess, that our family is safe, and there's likely a simple explanation. But the image of those two soundless lights rising and gliding away stays with me. On quiet nights, when fog presses against the window, I imagine them hovering beyond the pines, waiting. I told him that he should know. Tell this story because it's real. Nothing pursued us. Nothing followed the car. But something was there. Here's the rewritten text. The night was quiet at the Sinclair station near Route 66. Back in 1953, my shift dragged on slowly with barely any traffic breaking the desert's endless silence. The wind whipped dust around the gas pumps, creating an eerie atmosphere. When the Packard rolled in, something felt different. Dark blue and gleaming. It moved with an unnatural stillness that made me pause. The driver caught my attention immediately. Pale face, unblinking eyes, voice like a machine. "Good evening," he said. "Do the crafts still land nearby?" His question hung in the air. I was used to strange inquiries out here, but this was different. "Sometimes," I muttered, unsure how to respond. He didn't react, just waited with an unsettling calm that sent a chill down my spine. As I moved to pump his gas, I noticed something odd about the car. The metal seemed to swallow light, making everything around it look dull and faded. When I glanced back, the license plate had changed from having clear numbers to suddenly being completely blank. Years later, Claire and the kids never spoke about that night. We understood some experiences defy explanation. The road where it happened always felt different. A quiet emptiness that didn't belong. If the fog rolls in, I know I'll see it again. Some things you just accept and keep driving. That's exactly what we did. I gripped the counter, trying to stay calm as he sat there motionless. Most people asking questions like his would seem nervous, almost embarrassed, but not him. He spoke with absolute certainty, like what he was saying was simple fact. When I asked if there was anything inside, his response was vague, just directions punctuated by a gesture down the highway. The desert around the gas station was eerily silent. NT, no coyotes, no wind-rustling rocks, no distant highway sounds, just absolute stillness. The only noise was the steady drip of gas into the tank. He didn't move, just stared, and I found myself forcing steps closer to get a better look at his license plate. Nothing, just bare metal. My palm grew clammy. I wanted to ask why he was out here, but the words caught in my throat. The Packard's engine ticked quietly as it cooled, but something felt off. I realized I couldn't smell the usual gasoline or exhaust. The car's paint seemed to shimmer strangely, almost wet-looking, but wasn't. "Why are you here?" I finally asked, my voice low and uncertain. He tilted his head. "To see if anyone remembers," he said. "Remembers what?" He offered no explanation, just sat there, hands on the wheel, his pale face unchanging. Tension built in my stomach. My throat went dry. I tried to act normal, glancing at the pump, pretending to check the meter. When I looked back, the car seemed subtly different. The shadows around it weren't quite right. Its edges blurred like it didn't quite belong in this world. "I'd better get going," he said calmly. As he started to move, I watched, frozen. Then something extraordinary happened. The car didn't just drive, it rose smoothly, silently, lifting about 20 ft above the asphalt. Its headlights, previously dull, now glowed softly against the desert night. The metal caught starlight differently, not reflecting like any normal vehicle. The desert was empty when I finally blinked. I stood there, stunned, unable to process what I just witnessed. A vehicle had drifted straight up and then slowly arced over the station and highway, becoming just a faint speck among the stars. The wind returned, rattling the canopy and shaking dust from the station's roof. The Packard had vanished without a trace. When I tried calling the local deputy the next day, he dismissed my story, suggesting I'd had too much coffee. Even the regular truckers who'd passed through claimed no memory of anything unusual. For weeks afterwards, I scanned that stretch of road at night. Occasionally, I'd catch a distant light moving in ways that defied normal vehicle or aircraft behavior, but nothing ever resembled that car again. The desert seemed ordinary, except in my memories. I can't explain the inexplicable details, the strange license plate, the car's impossible hovering, the calm demeanor of the man, or the peculiar heaviness of the air during those moments. I never saw him again, and no one else ever spoke of such an encounter. I continued running the station for another year before selling it. Now, whenever I drive down Route 66, I find myself glancing at the stars, half expecting to see those ethereal headlights. Nothing has reappeared, yet the memory remains vivid. On windy nights, when dust kicks up around the pumps, I could swear I feel that same measured gaze watching me, and I know I'd recognize that flat, calm voice anywhere. It was 1952, and I was driving back from a job in Lincoln, Nebraska, along Highway 77. The night was clear, moonlight illuminating the black top. I'd been traveling since mid-afternoon, my old Chevy humming steadily, thinking about stopping for a meal when something caught my eye. A billboard stood beside the road where the cornfield began to thin. It looked brand new, almost garish under the moonlight. The advertisement was for a drink called Solora's Nectar, a name I assumed belonged to a new soda competing with established brands. Shiny letters, almost like enamel, surrounded a picture of a tall glass with what appeared to be fruit floating inside. I slowed down, considering a future stop to investigate. I knew exactly where the billboard had been, and I was sure about what I'd seen. It wasn't just confusion. Something felt heavier, like being caught off guard by something that shouldn't exist. The first time I saw it was late at night, standing alone in the dark, as if it had sprung up overnight. When I told my buddy George about it the next morning, he laughed and said I must have been tired. The following Saturday, I drove back to check. Not knocked down or vandalized, just vanished. I slowed the car, squinting down the road, but the cornfields were empty, with only old weathered fence posts. At the Waverley station, I asked the attendant about a new soda ad. He frowned and shook his head, saying he'd never heard of it or seen any new billboards. A week later, I returned during daylight, thinking I might have misremembered the location. The road looked normal. I stopped at a nearby farm and asked the farmer if he'd noticed anything unusual. He just raised his eyebrows and said no. Nothing strange, no new signs. But I swear every detail was vivid. The colors, the light, the glass of fruit. It felt so real, like it had been waiting right there for me. Then a few nights later, taking a different route back to Lincoln, I noticed something odd. Small lights hovered in the distance, too high and steady to be insects, not moving like airplanes or cars. They pulsed softly. As I drove closer, they seemed to fade, leaving only darkness. When I told George, he laughed dismissively, suggesting I'd been driving too much. But I kept thinking about the billboard. If someone had put it up as a joke, why remove it so cleanly? And those lights, maybe I was imagining things, but they felt connected, like two different sides of the same impossible moment. It was quiet, the wind low. My heart was thumping as I drove past the cornfield where I'd first seen the billboard. Something flickered just off the road, not solid, more a blur, like a shadow. I could see the shape of a tall glass fruit catching moonlight. I slammed on the brakes. Nothing was there, just dark, empty fields. I kept driving, trying to convince myself it was fatigue. The long highway stretches and monotonous core must have messed with my eyes. But then I noticed those little hovering lights again, closer this time, right over the fields. They didn't move quickly, just floated, almost watching me. I blinked, and one vanished, then another. By the time I passed that stretch, all were gone. When I got home, I told my wife. She listened politely, didn't ask questions. "You've been driving a lot," she said. "You need rest." I agreed. Maybe she was right. Maybe my mind had invented the billboard. Then came the strangest part. A few nights later, I was at a small diner outside Lincoln. The waitress brought my coffee, and her eyes flicked toward the window. "Did you see it?" she asked quietly. I frowned. She hesitated, then spoke about lights over the fields. People had been talking, seeing them all week. I didn't mention the billboard, didn't want to sound crazy. I just nodded, said I'd been driving too much. But inside, I knew she'd seen something too. A few nights later, I went back out. I couldn't shake the feeling. Something was off. The road was empty, air still. I passed where the billboard had been and saw a faint glow, like the sign was burning quietly, almost transparent over the corn. I blinked, and it was gone. Over the next few weeks, I kept looking. Every time I drove that highway stretch, I'd catch glimpses of lights, faint, hovering, always fleeting, sometimes close to the ground, sometimes high in the sky. Once I thought I saw the billboard's outline for a second before it vanished completely. I was Joe Mallory, just a kid from Portland, looking for steady work back in 1950 at a logging camp near the Cascades. 4 other men worked alongside me, Frank, Bill, Amos and Henry, who knew these mountains far better than I ever would. We'd been hauling firs and pines for weeks, living in rough canvas tents that leaked whenever the wind got too strong. The nights were eerily quiet, a silence that seemed to press against you. Only the wind through trees and the scrape of logs broke the stillness. We grew accustomed to this quiet, which made any unexpected sound feel magnified. One evening, while checking the line of cut timber along the camp's far edge, I spotted something sitting on a stump near the log stacking clearing. Initially, I thought one of the men was playing a prank. The figure remained motionless as I approached. It was clearly a man, but unlike any I'd seen before, tall, unnaturally so, maybe 7 feet high, and pale as fresh birch bark. His shoulders were rigid, and he seemed oblivious to his surroundings. No acknowledgement of the rustling leaves or the distant owl's cry. "Evening," I said cautiously. No response. I called out again. Silence. As I stepped closer, he finally spoke, his voice flat and strange. Years later, driving that same highway, I'd recall this moment, just like the strange billboard for Solara's nectar that no one else remembered, or the fleeting light I glimpsed hovering above a cornfield. No one I told believed me. The company, the billboard, the entire experience. It was as if none of it existed. Passing the old spot years later, everything looked normal. Cornfields stretched on both sides, the road quiet and clear. For a moment, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it all. Then, a flash of light, like a glass reflection above the field, made me press the accelerator and stare straight ahead. I stopped seeking explanations. Some experiences defy understanding. The world isn't as solid as it appears. Sometimes things slip through brief fly, revealing themselves whether we comprehend them or not. And all I could do was keep driving, watching, hoping whatever it was wouldn't follow me home. The stump was empty when we returned. No trace of the figure I'd seen earlier. Our lantern swept wide circles over mud and leaves, revealing nothing. No footprints, no sign of anyone. We stood there, mouths agape, until Amos broke the silence. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, but I knew what I'd seen. The next night, it returned. Same stump, same rigid posture, same expressionless stare. This time, I watched from a distance. The others were skeptical, though Henry cast nervous glances over his shoulder. The figure spoke again, monotone and precise. "Tests are finished." Bill, growing impatient, stepped closer. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure turned its head slightly, just enough to show awareness. We waited, tension thick in the misty air. Then it stood tall, turned toward the woods, walked a few steps, and vanished into the shadows. I searched the next morning, hoping to track it, but found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, as if it had been lifted from the ground. The men began speculating in hushed tones. Some thought it might be a deserter from the city or a hobo, but none of us had ever seen anyone like this, and no train or road came near these woods for miles. After that, the figure appeared at different times, sometimes late at night on the stump, other times at dusk, watching from the clearing's edge. Always calm, always quiet. No one attempted to follow it anymore. It was unsettling, and we all knew it. It started with me seeing this figure, precise like a textbook reading. When I first spotted it, I tried to ask, "Tests? What are you talking about?" But it just stared ahead, not looking at me or anywhere specific. I went back to the tents and told the others. Fra NK laughed it off, suggesting it was just kids seeing things. But Bill, who knew these woods better than anyone, frowned and suggested we investigate. We grabbed lanterns and returned cautiously, only to find an empty clearing that seemed to hold its own mysterious silence. The creek running through our logging camp had become more than just a landmark. It was where we first encountered something that defied explanation. I was checking a new line of logs when I saw it standing motionless, staring directly at me. Its movements were mechanical, almost robotic, with no hint of emotion. When it spoke, the words were simple but chilling. "Tests are finished just like that." Then it stepped into the water without a sound, leaving no trace. The ripples spread out as if something had passed through, but there were no footprints, no splashes. That night, Frank confirmed he'd seen something similar. A shadowy outline near the tent, speaking the same cryptic phrase. We started sleeping in shifts, lanterns close by. The woods felt different, more oppressive, pressing down on our canvas shelters. Over the next few weeks, I began documenting every encounter in a notebook. The pattern became clear. It appeared more frequently on still nights when the air was thick with wet pine and the creek ran quietly. Fog seemed to make it disappear. The final encounter was the most unsettling. I was stacking firewood when the mist rolled in quickly from the hills. That familiar voice emerged. "Tests are finished." It was right behind me, just a few feet away. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its presence, calm, watching. I whispered, "What are you testing?" Silence was the only response. When I blinked, it vanished. Nothing remained but fog, mud, and the creek's soft murmur. The next morning, my colleagues found me staring at a stump, lantern in hand. Bill tried to lighten the mood, suggesting maybe the tests were complete. Nobody wanted to discuss it further. A week later, I left the camp, the mystery unresolved. The morning was chilly in 1954, the kind of damp that sinks into your coat if you leave it hanging in the back. I was driving the 7:15 bus route out of Millersville, running between the county seat and farm scattered across the outskirts. With my thermos of coffee and a pack of cigarettes, I knew this route like the back of my hand. The fog was thick, making my headlights barely reach the next fence post. I pulled up to the small stop just past Harper's Hollow, a single wooden sign nailed crooked to a telephone pole. I was the only vehicle for miles, always scanning for farmers or school kids. That morning, 3 figures stood waiting. A man with a cap pulled low, a woman with her scarf wrapped tight, and a boy around 10 years old. They looked normal, but something about their posture in the dense fog made me pause. "Morning," I called, stopping the bus. They waved and I opened the doors. The man and woman climbed in, the boy following. They paid in change, but their silence struck me. No small talk, just quiet nods and murmurs as they moved toward the middle rows. Their coats rustled against the seats, and the fog continued to crawl across the road. Later, men had started whispering, and a tension I hadn't noticed before hung in the air. We all went our separate ways, and none of us ever saw the figure again. I considered writing a report for the logging company, but knew they'd think I was crazy. Honestly, I wasn't even sure I understood it myself. Decades later, I still remember the cold calm in its voice, the way it moved without leaving a mark, and the endless stillness it carried the figure spoke about tests that didn't seem to involve us, vanishing without a trace. It wasn't dangerous, but it left a quiet unease that followed, owed me long after the mountains disappeared behind the road. Sometimes I swear I can still hear those low, even words floating through the mist. Tests are finished. I never went back. Some things in those woods just aren't meant to be understood. The morning felt off from the start. My bus seemed to carry something more than just empty seats, a presence that pressed against me without making a sound. When I glanced in the mirror, the passengers weren't looking at me, just staring ahead with eyes that held a strange, dull reflection. Hollow Creek Bridge came into view, and something immediately struck me as wrong. The water beneath was impossibly still, like a sheet of glass. Normally, this creek always rippled, even through the thickest fog, but today it was completely motionless, catching the pale light in an unnatural way. I continued my route, pulling over at the second stop, an old wooden platform nestled among farm fields. The brake hissed as I called out, "Next stop, Millersville Station." But when I turned to check the passengers, the row was empty, completely empty. At first, I thought they might have slipped off while I was turning or checking my mirrors, yet I knew I was the only one who'd been driving. No footsteps, no coat rustling, nothing. I stepped down and searched the platform. No footprints, not even the faint drag marks a coat might leave. I checked the bus repeatedly, inside and out. The seats remained as empty as before. The fog thinned slightly, revealing nothing unusual, just the same worn benches and chipped platform paint. But I knew what I'd experienced. The weight of those passengers lingered like a cold draft, their blank stares etched in my memory. Driving on, the farmland around me felt eerily quiet. No crows, no barking dogs, no wind in the cornstalks, just the bus engine and occasional suspension groans. Miles later, effing caught my eye, a soft silvery light flickering behind the tree-line. Not a lamp, not a farmhouse glow, but something entirely different. I slowed down, squinting into the mist. I was driving my usual route early that morning when something caught my eye. A shape hovering just above the ground, not moving like a reflection would. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, and I chalked it up to morning fog and nerves. I'd driven this route for years, knowing how the mind can conjure shapes out of nothing. At Millersville Station, I stopped the bus and did my usual check. Empty benches, no passengers. I asked Old Man Reed, the ticket clear, if anyone had been on my bus. He gave me a strange look, frowning as I described the 3 passengers I'd picked up at Harper's Hollow. "Never heard anyone come from that direction this early," he said. "Roads out there are empty before 7. The memory haunted me on the drive home. The fog had burned away, revealing a pale sun and the town slowly waking up. But in my mind, I kept seeing them. The man with the low cap, the woman with her scarf pulled tight, the boy staring ahead, and that soft silver shimmer behind the trees that seemed to follow us. A few days later, I went back to Harper's Hollow, hoping to find some trace of those passengers. Nothing, just fog rolling across empty fields and the old wooden sign as crooked as ever. I went back to my routine, and nothing like that happened again. But sometimes when the fog rolls in and the morning is unnaturally still, I catch a glimpse of a faint silver shape at the edge of the trees, watching, waiting, and for a moment I wonder. I still check the mirrors a little longer than I should, just in case. The memory of that bus ride haunts me, how the seats felt heavier, the emptiness where passengers should have been. It never came close, never made a sound. Sometimes I wonder if I should turn around, go back to that empty stop, just to see if it was all real, or if I'm the only one who remembers. The first grey light was seeping through the curtains of the sheriff's office when I woke up. Dawn made everything look softer, but colder. Coffee and sawdust from the floors I'd scrubbed the night before lingered in the air. I rubbed my eyes and noticed the silence. Too quiet for a town that usually had someone heading to the diner or depot. Just outside my window, a line of people stood on the courthouse steps, shoulder to shoulder, all facing the same direction. I froze, trying to make sense of it. Millersville was a tiny place, barely 100 folks living here. I knew everyone by sight, but not everyone in this line. My boots crunched on frost-hardened gravel as I stepped out. They didn't move or look at me, just stood perfectly still. The air felt heavy, pressing down on my shoulders. "Morning, folks. Everything's all right?" No answer. Walking closer, my heart started pounding. Their positioning was odd. Feet perfectly straight, hands at their sides, heads tilted slightly forward. No breath clouds in the cold air. Some I recognized: Mrs. Hensley from the bakery, old Tom Miller from the hardware store, young Vicky Langley. Others were complete strangers. I called out again, louder. Approaching a woman in a blue coat, I saw she didn't flinch, blink, or breathe. When I tapped her shoulder, she started walking. Not running, just walking. And then everyone followed, moving at the exact same pace. I wandered down Main Street, searching for signs of life after witnessing something extraordinary at the courthouse. The streets were eerily quiet, with the diner's door open and steam rising from coffee urns, but no one inside. The bakery was just as empty. In the distance, a line of people moved with an unusual rhythm, not marching aggressive, but controlled and deliberate. As the sun climbed higher, early farmers and schoolchildren began to appear. I called out, hoping someone might acknowledge what I'd seen, but they moved about their morning as if nothing unusual had happened. Their normally felt unsettling. Returning to the courthouse, I needed to confirm what I'd witnessed. The frost on the steps still held the imprint of footprints, faint but visible, slowly fading in the growing warmth. I knelt down, tracing the shapes with my gloved hand. Each print was identical, same size, same depth, perfectly uniform. I spoke with locals, seeking confirmation. Mrs. Hensley claimed she'd slept through everything, her tone unconvincing. Old Tom Miller insisted he'd been in his shed all morning, but his account seemed uncertain, his timeline blurry. Something felt off. Every story seemed slightly altered, like memories had been carefully stitched over something else. Small details caught my attention. A lantern mysteriously moved on Mrs. B. Hensley's porch, despite her insistence otherwise. The silent line of people descending the courthouse steps remained vivid in my mind. They had moved in perfect unison, facing the same direction, then dispersed into town as if they were never there. The frost-pressed footprints were my only tangible evidence of their passage. I couldn't shake the weight at that moment, a strange pressing sensation that had overcome me when I first witnessed their synchronized movement. Something significant had happened, but no one seemed willing or able to acknowledge it. The town felt different that day. A shovel in the hardware store yard had moved, leaning against the fence in a new spot. No one admitted to shifting it. The morning stretched with extra minutes that seemed to slip by unnoticed. By midday, everything appeared normal. Kids laughed near the schoolhouse. People filled the diner, and the usual sounds returned. But something lingered beneath the surface. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Shadows flickered at the edges of side streets. Figures would stand perfectly still in alleyways, vanishing the moment I looked closer. They were strangers I'd never seen before. That evening, I tried writing down my observations in my office. My hand would pause, uncertain of my own memories. The line on the courthouse steps haunted me. Something was off about the people. Even those I knew well seemed distant, as if not entirely themselves. At dusk, I walked the streets one last time. Lanterns glowed warmly from porches. Smoke curled from chimneys. The courthouse steps were now clear of the mysterious frost prints, replaced by long shadows stretching in the twilight. For a brief moment, I glimpsed figures forming a line at the edge of my vision. Silent, still, all facing the same direction. When I blinked, they disappeared. Years passed, but I never stopped noticing the small, strange occurrences. Objects would shift slightly out of place. Shadows seemed to move unnaturally. A rhythm hung in the air, as if something had passed through town, and everyone had unconsciously followed. I tried sharing my experience with others, but most laughed or looked at me with concern. Eventually, I stopped talking about it. On quiet nights, when the wind rattles the windows, I still see those silent figures on the courthouse steps, hear their soft footsteps marching in unison. The mystery remains unsolved, a lingering question mark in my memory. I was driving down Route 66 in 1953, heading west toward Oklahoma City. The highway stretched out before me, almost empty except for the occasional pickup or truck. Late afternoon sun hung low, still hot, and the asphalt seemed to radiate heat. Everything looked washed out in dust and light. I had my South SB bag on the passenger seat, filled with catalogues and samples, and a thermos of coffee I sipped from time to time. About 20 meters out of Tulsa, I noticed the first billboard, just a standard roadside advertisement with a gleaming sedan and bold letters. What caught my attention were the lights strung across the top. They blinked in a strange pattern. 3 quick flashes, 3 long ones, then 3 quick again. I chuckled, thinking maybe some kid had rigged a timer as a prank. But then something odd happened. By the next curve, I saw the exact same billboard, same car, same ad, same blinking lights, exact same pattern. I slowed down, checking the side roads. They were empty. Miles of straight highway surrounded me. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. At the next exit, I stopped at a small diner to clear my head. Only the cook was there. When I asked about the billboard, he looked confused. "Which one?" he said. "There's only one around here for miles." He gestured vaguely toward the highway and shrugged. "Lights aren't even working tonight. Been out for a week." Something passed through that day. I made it home that morning, and the town carried on. But I can't shake the feeling that something moved through Millersville, leaving everyone subtly changed. It wasn't violent or loud, just a quiet, orderly intrusion that didn't belong. And I can't explain any of it. The highway stretched out before me, long shadows cutting across the asphalt as the sun dipped behind low hills. I was driving, my mind wandering, when something caught my eye. A billboard. First time I thought maybe I'd imagined it. But then it happened again and again. The lights were methodical. Short, short, short. Long, 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 short, short. Not random. Mechanical. Precise. I checked my mirrors. Nothing behind me. No other vehicles. No turn-offs I might have missed. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. I slowed down, trying to get a better look. 50 mapped, then 40. Nothing on the ground. Nothing in the air. Sweat started to form on the back of my neck. The third time, I knew I wasn't imagining anything. Same billboard, same exact spot, same blinking pattern. Heart racing. I pulled over. The truck's engine hummed. Wind whispered over the empty plains. I got out, walked to the roadside. No tire marks, no tracks, no wires, no controls. Just an empty billboard standing there. Back in the truck, I tried to rationalize it. Too much coffee, too much sun, exhaustion, playing tricks. I drove on, eyes scanning the horizon, waiting, expecting, but nothing appeared for another 30 metal. At the next town, I stopped for gas. A young attendant named Harold pumped my fuel. We chatted. I mentioned the billboard. His response stopped me cold. Billboard? You mean that old Ford Dad? It's been empty for months. Lights haven't worked in weeks. The pattern remained burned in my memory. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. Like a code, a signal. But from where? From who? As I pulled back onto the highway, questions swirled in my mind, with no answers in sight. The highway stretched out empty. Nothing but the sound of tires on asphalt and distant train whistles breaking the silence. Night had fallen completely before I reached Oklahoma City's outskirts. Something nagged at me, a memory of blinking lights on a billboard that I couldn't shake. I'd seen it 3 times. Each time the pattern was identical, too precise to be random. No one would believe a salesman from Tulsa about strange lights, so I'd kept quiet. Phones were only at pay stations, and I had no one to call anyway. At the motel, I parked under a street lamp. Its light made my truck feel safer somehow. I sat there trying to make sense of the day. Was it a heat mirage? Fatigue? But I never knew better. The lights had been perfect, deliberate. Sleep was restless. I kept seeing the billboard against the twilight, those repeating lights burning into my memory. My dreams were a blur of endless highways, dark billboards, and mysterious blinking signals in the sky. The next morning, I drove back to check. Everything looked normal. Bright sunlight, clear skies. The billboard stood silent, its wires rusted. No trace of the previous night's strange display. Walked around it, searching for any sign, any mechanism, nothing. I left and kept driving. I haven't seen that pattern again. Haven't returned to that Route 66 stretch. But sometimes, on long, empty roads at night, I catch flashes of light at the edge of my vision. A rhythm that doesn't belong to anything I understand. The memory weighs on me, a constant companion. I don't know what I saw or why. I only know it happened. And some part of me will never forget those perfect, deliberate lights. The night was cold and damp with fog rolling in off the river, making streetlights look like halos. I was 15, standing outside a small diner in Ashford, waiting to use the payphone. My school jacket hung over a button-down shirt, and I fiddled with a coin in my pocket while watching my breath curl in the chilly air. Marcy had asked me to call her, but the phone booth was occupied. When it finally became free, I dropped in a nickel and lifted the receiver. The dial tone sounded weak, as if it had been repaired too many times. I dialed her number, trying to ignore the mist creeping up around my ankles. The moment I hit the last digit, something strange happened. A voice spoke, flat and metallic, like it had been processed through a machine. Walter Hughes, December 4th, 1939, it said. I nearly dropped the receiver, my heart racing. Was this some kind of prank by older kids, that the street was empty, with only the Ina's distant glow visible through the thick fog? "Who is this?" I asked, my voice higher than I intended. Silence followed. Then the same message, repeated precisely. "Walter Hughes, December 4th, 1939. Thinking I might have misheard, I hung up and tried dialing again. Nothing, just dead silence and a faint electrical hum. I looked around the corner, expecting to see someone, but found only more fog and hazy light. Inside the diner, I asked Mrs. Callahan to use their phone. She handed me the receiver without a word. I dialed Marcy's number again. After 2 rings, there was a click. Not the usual sound, but a long, low, static hum. Then the same voice returned. "Walter Hughes, December 4th, 1939. I slammed down the receiver, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the evening's cold. Mrs. Callahan approached, frowning. And now, every time I recall that moment, I feel the same mix of disbelief and unease I experienced on that highway in 1953. A sense of being followed by blinking lights I couldn't escape. She asked if I'd been talking to myself, and I shook my head. But her look told me she thought I was just a kid who didn't understand how adults worked. According to her, the phone line never connected. No call went through. Not to my friend, not to anyone. I was confused. I told her I'd called Marcy, but she shook her head. Nobody answered. I hadn't called anyone. I didn't argue. Something wasn't adding up, and I couldn't explain it. My hands trembled as I paid for coffee, trying to make sense of things. The next day, I told Marcy about the incident. She didn't believe me, said I'd imagined it all. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was just tired, my nerves frayed after school. But then, the dreams started. Not exactly nightmares, but a voice repeating itself while I slept. Sometimes it was clear and crisp, like a metallic whisper. Other times, it stretched head and bent, blurring the line between wakefulness and sleep. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, staring at the ceiling, certain something was watching me. A few nights later, I returned to the corner. Maybe I'd overreacted. The fog was thicker, the street empty. The diner's neon sign flickered weakly through the mist. I leaned against the phone booth, half expecting nothing to happen. I lifted the receiver, dropped in a coin, didn't even dial. The line clicked. Walter Hughes, December 4th, 1939. The voice said. I nearly dropped the phone. How? What? I stammered. The fog pressed closer, wrapping the street in soundless pressure. No one was around. The diner windows were empty. The street was empty. My hands shook. I hung up and didn't go back. Over the next few weeks, things started disappearing. Small items at first, school books out of place, notes vanished from my desk, coins missing from my pocket. Not much, nothing dramatic, but enough to make me doubt myself. I asked my parents, but they said I was just losing track of things. Maybe they were right, yet the voice never went away. Occasionally, when I was alone, I'd hear it faintly whispering my name, sometimes in radio static, sometimes in the electrical hum of appliances. December 4th, 1939. Walter Hughes. The date was etched into my memory, whispered through a mysterious phone call that haunted me for years. Most of my friends dismissed my story. They laughed, calling it a dream or some elaborate trick. But I knew what I'd heard, and the memory never faded. One foggy evening in Ashford, I decided to confront my uncertainty. Streetlights glowed softly through the mist, casting gentle halos around me. My feet squished in the damp ground as I approached the corner payphone. Heart racing, I lifted the receiver, desperate for answers. The line clicked. A low buzzing filled the earpiece. I waited, expecting the voice to return. but silence stretched out. Then a strange sound emerged, like paper rustling, but not quite human. Faint and irregular, it stopped as suddenly as it began. I hung up slowly, surrounded by the fog's quiet embrace. Something felt different. Something had been listening, watching. Not quite a voice, not quite a presence, but something undeniably there. After that night, I avoided public phones. I'd call Marcy from her house or wait until I was home. The voice didn't follow me everywhere, but it lingered in my mind. Sometimes, while doing homework, I'd hear a faint echo seeming to drift from the walls. Years later, I returned to Ashford. The town had changed. The diner was now a small grocery store, but the street remained quiet, fog rolling in from the river just as it had decades earlier. I stood remembering that moment, that inexplicable experience. I never heard the voice repeat my birth date again after leaving town, but the memory persisted. Late at night, I sometimes sense a quiet, mechanical presence lurking just beyond the light's reach. It makes me wonder about those fleeting moments we catch, those unexplained fragments that slipped through our understanding. I never went near that payphone again. The morning was quiet, just me and the bay back in 1954. I'd been out on my little skiff since 3 a.m., used to these solitary hours with nothing but gulls and salt air. Hauling nets was my routine, and I expected nothing unusual that day. But something felt off when I pulled the net up around 3:30. It was heavier than normal, yet strangely still. Peering inside, I saw something that stopped me cold. Every single fish lay dead, perfectly motionless. Their scales had an unnatural glow, not moonlight, but a faint phosphorescent shimmer from within. In 20 years of fishing Marshport Bay, I've never seen anything like it. My mind raced through possibilities. Chemical contamination from upriver factories, but the metallic scent was too subtle, and that eerie glow made no sense. I tilted the net, half expecting movement. Nothing. Not a single twitch. Then I saw it. Beyond my oars, maybe 100 ft out, a smooth, silvery shape hovered silently above the waves. At first, I thought it was fog catching moonlight, but it wasn't moving with the wind. Just a blur of reflected metal hanging impossibly still in the thick morning mist. My stomach tightened. Something was wrong. Now, years later, that memory still haunts me. The faintest hint of static or a mechanical whisper brings it all back. That foggy street, the diner, a voice saying my name and birth date like it had been waiting. The morning started like any other, out on the bay with my fishing nets. But something was different. A shape hung motionless just above the water, not moving like anything mechanical. It rose slowly, smoothly, straight up. In a blink, it vanished completely. No sound, no disturbance, just gone. The dead fish in my net was still there, but an unsettling feeling crept over me. I'd been watched. My hands trembled. My chest felt tight. When I shook the net, the fish shimmered faintly in the dim light. I dropped it back over the side, suddenly reluctant to touch them. Something strange caught my eye. The water around the net glowed softly, as if the fish had left a trail, or maybe the light was seeping into the water itself. When I leaned closer and breathed over it, the glow dimmed. I jerked back, confused. My mind raced with possible explanations, military tests, some new chemical, but nothing I knew could make fish glow and cause a silent object to hover above the bay. As I paddled toward the dock, movement on the horizon caught my attention. A faint flicker in the fog. Another shape, perhaps the same one, drifted low and slow. I froze. My paddle slipped, and I grabbed it to prevent noise. The thing seemed to sense me, hovering briefly before drifting aside and vanishing behind a thick bank of fog. Exhausted and shaking, I reached the dock around 6. The town was waking up, lanterns flickering, people beginning their day. I said nothing. Who would believe me? I unloaded the nets, trying to steady my trembling hands. Neighbors asked about the catch. I lied, claiming the tide had been slow. Ed Whitaker, one of the old-timers, noticed my shaking and asked what was wrong. I mumbled something about a cold wind and retreated to my shack, unable to even touch breakfast. The fog rolls in sometimes, and I swear I see that silver blur low over the water. I slow my boat down, watching the ripples, and the shape appears and vanishes before I can even point. No sound, no movement except the hovering. And the water seems to shiver, like it knows something I don't. I've tried everything to explain it. The tides, the fog, chemicals, my imagination. But it doesn't fit. The glow on the fish haunts me most. It was like they'd been lit from something beyond me. Something I can't see. I've stopped fishing alone at night. I don't trust it. A week earlier, I spoke with Sam, who runs the bait shop. He mentioned a few fishermen had come in around the same time, saying their nets were strange that morning, but none of them talked about glowing fish. I didn't ask more. Talking about it felt wrong, like mentioning it would make it real again. The fish were back to normal in the bay. No more glow, no more dead nets. Nothing unusual, just my boat and the water and the gulls. I tried not to think about it, but the memory of that silver shape hovering above the water wouldn't leave me. Some nights, I'd wake up hearing faint humming sounds over the bay, or catch a glint of something reflected in the fog when I wasn't expecting it. It was never there when I got closer, though, just a flicker at the edge of my vision. In the early morning fog, it's too perfect, too quiet. I find myself looking out over the water, wondering if it's back again, just hovering, waiting, silent, and shining faintly in the mist. The street was dark, and at first I thought it might be a power outage or a blown fuse, but the sky was clear, not a storm in sight. As I took a few cautious steps forward, I realized I wasn't alone. Callahan from the bakery, Joe Carter from the bank, and a handful of others were standing motionless, their heads tilted upward, mouths slightly agape. Soft, uncertain murmurs floated through the air. I caught snippets of hushed conversations, punctuated by the occasional scrape of shoes on wet asphalt. Suddenly, the lights flickered back to life, one by one, casting their familiar glow across the street. That's when I saw it, or rather, what everyone else was staring at. It was enormous. Not just big, but massive, as if someone had draped a giant dark tarp across the night sky. This wasn't like any aircraft or balloon I'd ever seen. No lights, no discernible shape, just a solid dark blot obscuring the stars. People whispered and pointed, but the thing itself remained eerily silent. I found myself stepping back, trying to get a better view, or perhaps convince myself it wasn't real. Mr. Carter mumbled something about clouds, but the sky was crystal clear. Mrs. Callahan spoke softly, saying she felt a sudden chill, as if the air had changed. The others nodded in agreement. Then, as quietly as it had appeared, it vanished, not with a dramatic sweep or rush, but like someone had simply wiped it away with a sponge. One moment the stars were blocked, the next they were visible. Tiny pinpricks of light against the black sky. The streetlights hummed normally, as if Namoko Owing had happened. For a few seconds, no one moved. We just stood there, breathing shallowly, unsure of what we just witnessed. I approached Joe Carter. "Did you see that?" I asked. It wasn't moving, not like anything I'd ever seen before. Strangely, no one wanted to discuss it further. We silently drifted back to our homes, occasionally glancing over our shoulders. Whispers about the shadow lingered, but no one dared to elaborate. It felt as if talking about it would somehow make it real again. That night, sleep eluded me. I tried to sketch the shape in my mind, but it was futile. My attempts on paper never matched my memory. The angles and edges defied logic, impossible to capture or comprehend. The town was whispering after that night. Some claimed they'd seen something, while others insisted nothing unusual had happened. I'd been watching the sky, remembering that moment of impossible darkness with its strange proportions. The power company found no explanation for the blackout, which only added to the mystery. Nights passed, and I'd lurk near the diner's corner, scanning Main Street. Everything seemed normal. Streetlights buzzing, the sky stretching endlessly overhead. I avoided talking about what I'd witnessed. Discussing it felt like an invitation for something to reappear. Then it happened again. Walking back late one night, my coat pulled tight against the cold. I caught a flicker in the alley behind the general store, a shadow, quick, sharp, vanishing before I could focus. The street remained empty, the air still. No footsteps, no smell, just a sensation of something being cut from the edge of my vision. The asphalt looked different when I passed again, faintly glossy, as if smoothed by an unseen hand. No tracks, no evidence, just a subtle wrongness that made me step back. The following night, I sat in my car at the diner's lot, watching. My eyes kept drifting to the sky, searching for something I couldn't name. Suddenly, all the streetlights flickered simultaneously. A heaviness pressed down around me, not in the air, but in the space itself. Less than a minute, and then everything returned to normal. For months afterward, I watched the streetlights. Something had changed, though I couldn't explain what. The town continued its quiet routine, but I knew something lurked just beyond perception, waiting. The night was dark, and the fields were grey when I first saw the plane. I'd been walking home from my cousin's place in the valley, kicking stones along the dirt road between my uncle's farm and the old Johnson place, thinking about supper. Something about the plane's lights caught my eye. They blinked in strange, irregular patterns, red, green, white, almost like a broken Morse code. I stopped and squinted, wondering if my eyes were playing tricks. The small aircraft, like a crop duster, was descending toward the open fields near the creek. At first, there was no engine sound, just the distant hiss of wind. Then, a faint worrying noise started, as if the plane was settling onto the ground. I trudged through wet dirt and mud, everything smelling of cold earth and grass. I was going to call out, thinking the pilot might need help. But when I got close, I realized something was off. The cockpit was empty. I leaned over the wing and peeked inside. No one. The controls sat untouched, the engine cold. A faint fuel smell lingered, but nothing suggested recent activity. Years later, this moment still haunts me. Sometimes when I pass through Maine late at night, I'll see townspeople looking up, uncertain. Not everyone, just a few. They seem changed, marked by something they can't explain. I never approach them. I understand their silence. Late at night, when everything could gee is still, I'll catch a flicker of shadow, and remember that black shape that blocked the stars. I look up, hoping the lights will stay steady, hoping whatever it was has moved on. People wouldn't believe my story. It sounds like nothing, just a shadow, an empty plane, a few witnesses. But sometimes in the quiet hours, I wonder if it's still out there, watching, waiting while the lights burn on Main Street. The field was a flat stretch of mud and grass, with a plane sitting silently. I'd found it here recently, and stepped back, trying to make sense of the scene. The doors were locked from the inside, and no footprints led away. I circled the aircraft, shining my flashlight along its wheels and tail. Everything seemed normal, except for the strange way the light stopped blinking when I got close, then started again after I moved away. A quick glance down the road revealed nothing. No farmer, no mechanic from town, nobody. A prickle ran along my neck, that uneasy feeling when the world suddenly seems too quiet. A faint sound caught my attention, like distant metal scraping across stone. But it didn't make sense. The only metal around was the plane itself. I spun toward the aircraft. The cockpit remained empty, but the lights were shifting, blinking faster now. Without any rhythm, I could understand. Something held me there. Maybe curiosity. As I took a step closer, I noticed something odd. Faint marks in the mud around the plane. Circular impressions suggested the wheels had been lifted and moved in small arcs, but some prints didn't match anything familiar. They were smaller, almost as if they had fingers. Bending down, I poked at the marks with a stick. The mud had set, but the impressions remained sharp and deliberate. A sudden wind pressed against my chest. Not a gust, but a steady pressure. Overhead, clouds shifted briefly, revealing a thin streak of sky before closing again. The plane's lights reflected off the wet grass, creating a wavering effect that made everything seem to move. My flashlight started flickering, though the batteries were fine. I shook it, and it worked again. The thought of shouting for help crossed my mind, but my voice didn't sound right in the open field. It seemed too sharp, too echoing, like it wasn't even mine. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind. Then I saw them. Shadows moving along the tree line by the creek. Nothing solid, just darker shapes that didn't belong. They weren't running or walking, just shifting, watching me. The plane's lights went out completely for a moment. When they returned, the blinking sequence had changed again. No longer random, but deliberate. I was walking near an abandoned field, and something felt off from the start. The dirt road vanished into darkness, and strange shapes had been watching me along the creek before suddenly disappearing. A plane sat blinking its lights, almost challenging me to come closer. My boot sank into the mud with each step as I circled the field, trying to find a way out. My heart beat slowly and heavily, and the air carried an odd scent, like metal and rain mixed with something sweet and barely perceptible. I couldn't quite explain it, but something was definitely wrong. When I approached the edge of the field where the Johnson's barn should have been, I heard a soft thump behind me. I turned quickly, but saw nothing. Then another sound came, rhythmic, like a footstep or something heavier. I ran a bit, then stopped, gasping. The plane's lights had changed. No longer blinking, they now glowed steadily and dimly from each wing tip. Despite my fear, curiosity pulled me closer. I needed to understand what was happening. The cockpit remained empty, and the engine was cold when I pressed my palm against the metal. A second effect, trans-tingling sensation ran through my hand, stronger than before, as if the plane itself was alive. Suddenly, without warning, the lights began blinking rapidly. Once, twice, then all at once. The sequence flashed so quickly it almost made my eyes water, like an unreadable code. I stumbled back, covering my face. When I looked again, everything had changed. The field was empty. The plane had vanished completely. I spun around, searching for any trace. No tire tracks, no disturbed. Mud beyond my own footprints. Just an open field and a dark sky pressing down, leaving me with more questions than answers. I was running the soda fountain at Miller's Hall that Saturday night. The place buzzed with energy. Folks from town and neighboring counties had packed in for the dance. At 19, I was a bit nervous around crowds, but I loved the Saturday night atmosphere. My job was pouring drinks and keeping an eye on the record player to ensure smooth music. The brass band records spun on the Victrola with laughter and clicking heels filling the hall. Around 11, something strange happened. The band's record slowed down unexpectedly. I thought someone might have tampered with it, or the turntable's spring was failing. Suddenly, the song stopped completely. The lights remained on, and nothing tripped in the fuse box. I leaned over the machine, carefully checking the arm, spindle, and needle. Everything appeared normal, but the record wouldn't budge. I tried nudging it, jiggling the crank, and even swapping it with another record. Nothing worked. As I stepped back, puzzled, I noticed dancers turning toward the windows. At first, I assumed someone had parked a truck with bright headlights, but that didn't explain the strange shapes and colors. The younger kids pressed their faces to the glass, pointing and whispering excitedly. Later, I found myself on a muddy road. My boot sinking with each step, I recognized the fence line and made my way back to the main dirt road row. Looking over my shoulder, the field behind me seemed untouched. I continued walking until the Johnson Place's lights appeared in the distance. I shared the story with my uncle, who suggested it might have been a prank or a small aircraft, but no one had reported a plane, and nobody checked the field that night. For months, I pondered the experience. Whenever I tried explaining the lights, prints, and shadows, I'd end up shrugging. There was no proof, only my memory. A memory of something that didn't belong in my known world. Years later, I still think about that night when passing the field. Sometimes when the wind shifts just right, I swear I can see faint glimmers moving along the grass, like lights blinking just beyond reach. I don't go there anymore, especially not at night, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, the metal beneath my hands, and how the air tasted different during those few minutes in 1953. Nothing else explains it. The night was thick with darkness, but the sky was clear. From the side window near the parking lot, something caught my eye. At first, it looked like a street lamp reflecting off the clouds, but this was different. A pale greenish glow hovered silently above the hall, casting a soft light over the rooftops and road. People outside stood frozen, shielding their eyes. Adults murmured quietly, but no one spoke much. The light remained steady, almost as if it were watching them. It didn't move like a plane, and I couldn't make out any wings. The hairs on my neck prickled. Without warning, the record player started again, picking up exactly where it had stopped. I swear I hadn't touched anything. My hands were at my sides the whole time. The music had an odd, stretched-out echo that sent a chill down my spine. I stepped outside, or air, trying to shake off the strange feeling. The glow had shifted closer to the tree-ine behind the hall. Its distance was hard to judge, with no sound or hum to indicate its size or speed. The edges were blurry like a cloud lit from within. Some kids had wandered back inside. A few older men whispered together, hands shading their eyes. Harold, who ran the local gas stations, muttered, "I've seen lights over the plains before, but never like that." I nodded, uncertain how much I really understood. Through the front windows, dancing continued inside. Nobody seemed to notice the glow anymore, or maybe they couldn't see it from their angle. I couldn't tell if I felt relieved or more unsettled. Turning back, my eyes caught tiny movements around the object. Fleeting shadows flickered in front of the glow. For a moment I thought I saw thin, elongated figures, but each time I blinked or shifted my gaze, they vanished. The night was thick with music and dancing at Miller's Hall. I was pouring drinks when something caught my eye near the tree-line. A strange glow hovered just beyond the woods, barely noticeable. Most people around me seemed oblivious. I hesitated, then moved closer. The light seemed to have a strange texture, almost like uneven panels reflecting moonlight. Maybe my imagination was creating patterns where none existed. A heavy feeling pressed against my chest, warning me not to approach too closely. Slowly, the light drifted eastward, not like an aircraft, but as if carried by the air itself. When I blinked, it seemed to have moved further away. I tried calling to Harold and the other men, but my voice disappeared into the night. By the time they turned to look, the light had risen higher, then tilted and vanished faster than I could track. Afterward, nobody spoke much. The band continued playing. Dancers kept moving, and I mechanically served driver. In case my mind stuck on what I'd seen, the image haunted me. On my drive home in my little Ford, I scanned the empty countryside roads and sky, searching for any sign of that light. Nothing. Just the familiar, quiet night. I told my parents I was late helping at the hall. They didn't ask questions, and I didn't elaborate. The next morning, I drove past Miller's Hall. Everything looked normal. An empty parking lot. Silent building. Later, when I tried sharing the story with friends, they laughed it off. Balloons, lanterns. They offered dismissive explanations. I had no counter-argument, yet I never truly forgot. On clear nights, I still find myself looking skyward, hoping to see something similar. The memory remains. The record's slow stop, that greenish glow, an unexplainable stillness, more profound than anything before or since. I can't explain what I saw that night. I only know it wasn't anything ordinary. For those brief moments, Miller's Hall, with its music and laughter, felt small and fragile beneath that quiet light. Sometimes I tell myself it was just shadows and reflections playing in the darkness, but deep down, I know what I experienced was something more. The train's late-night journey from Cedar Rapids to Chicago was like any other. I settled in with my worn coat and suitcase, hoping to catch some sleep. As I moved through the cars, the familiar scene unfolded. Businessmen with newspapers, families dozing, the soft rumble of nighttime travel. But something felt different in the third car from the back. It was almost empty, save for a single man sitting by the window. He wasn't looking at the passing landscape or the stations we rolled through. Instead, his gaze was fixed on something beyond, something invisible. The dim overhead light flickered, casting strange shadows. He wore a dark overcoat and a hat pulled low, obscuring most of his face. I sat across the aisle, watching him from the corner of my eye. He remained completely still, unnaturally so, Then I noticed something odd. His reflection in the window didn't quite match his movements. The image seemed slightly delayed, as if out of sync. When other passengers entered the car, they gave him a wide berth. The conductor passed through, seemingly unaware of his presence. I tried to ask a nearby passenger about him, but she claimed not to see anyone. Whispers started among the other travelers. Some sat near the door, looking uncomfortable, but unable to explain why. The train continued its journey, and with each passing moment, the atmosphere grew more unsettling. When he finally moved, it was so slow it was almost imperceptible. The overhead light flickered violently, gone for a split second, then back. And suddenly, he was looking directly at me. Even now, years later, when a record player unexpectedly stops, I feel that same heavy sensation, like the world is holding its breath, waiting. The train slowed into an unfamiliar station. Platform lights spilled into the car, but the man I thought had been sitting across from me was already standing. His movement was unnaturally smooth, without a sound from his coat or hat. He walked to the far end of the car and disappeared through the door. I tried to follow, but the door was locked from the inside. The conductor was gone before I could explain anything. I searched every car forward and back, but found no trace of the man. The seats where he had been sitting looked completely normal, as if no one had ever occupied them. Back in my seat in the third car, the overhead light flickered. When it stabilized, I looked out the window and saw him standing outside with empty tracks and darkness stretching behind him. He seemed to tilt his head slightly, looking directly at me. Then he vanished. I wondered if I had dozed off, if it was just a dream. But my wrinkled coat and suitcase in the aisle confirmed something had happened. Unsettled, I moved to the next car. Other passengers noticed my tension. I tried making small talk, but kept glancing back toward the empty car. Every light flicker made shadows seem to move in the far window, tightening my chest. At a later stop, I found a conductor and described what I'd seen. He frowned and said the third car had been checked before departure with no passengers present. He shrugged it off, suggesting I was tired. I tried to focus on the dark landscape and the rhythmic wheel clicks, but I felt watched. At every stop, I expected the figure to reappear, but he never did. When the train finally reached Chicago, I was shaking, exhausted, and relieved to step onto the platform. I was in my living room in 1955, the radio humming low behind me, and the whole neighborhood seemed to be leaning into the tiny, flickering television like it held the evening itself. Quiz Night Live had drawn every family in our small town to their sets. My sister Peggy sat beside me on the edge of the worn sofa, and we were both trying to remember answers to questions about geography and history. The room smelled faintly of soap and melted butter from Dad's popcorn. Then it happened. The screen didn't just flicker. It twisted almost like someone had hit it with a fist, though no one in the room had moved. For a fraction of a second, the image shifted from the host's cheery face to something entirely different, wide and low to the ground. It was metallic, reflecting pale moonlight, or maybe studio lights. I couldn't tell. It hovered above a cornfield, swaying slowly as though floating on invisible air currents. No people, no cars, nothing else in sight. Just this machine, quiet and perfectly still. I blinked, and it was gone. The broadcast resumed as if nothing had happened, the host smiling and introducing the next round of questions. Weeks later, I realized something strange. When I told a friend at the office about what I'd seen, Nobody else remembered. Not the weird image, not the strange moment. Only me. I didn't mention it again, just tried to act like it hadn't happened. Later that night, I took a cab home, looking over my shoulder the whole way. Streetlights felt weak and far apart. Every shadow made me flinch. Once inside my apartment, I locked the door and leaned against it, breathing heavily. I kept imagining something standing outside, waiting for the moment I looked away. I checked the papers the next day, searching for any mention of a strange occurrence. Nothing. My neighbors, friends, everyone I asked said everything was normal. Sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I can see that figure standing by the window, pat low, staring out, not moving, just observing. And I still can't figure out exactly what I saw or why I was the only one who, or did. I froze, staring at the screen, the moment feeling unnatural. Running to the front window, I scanned the street for any sign of movement. Yellow gas lamplight illuminated the quiet road, wind rustling through trees. Nothing stirred. When I reached for the phone to call Mr. Carbland, Peggy stopped me. "Wait until morning," she said, her face pale in the lamplight. "We'll look foolish." That night, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the metallic shape hovering over the corn, its eerie stillness reflecting light. The next day at the diner, I tried discussing the incident. Mr. Clark, who ran the grocery store, looked confused when I asked about a flicker. "Show ran fine," he said. Mrs. Abbott, living behind the gas station, echoed his sentiment. What flicker? Just a technical difficulty, they claimed. Strange occurrences began plaguing E-Town. Lights flickered inexplicably. Shadows moved unnaturally along building sides. Jenkins stand motionless in his yard for what seemed an eternity, staring at nothing. No one remarked on his behavior. I started documenting everything. The broadcast flicker happened precisely at 8:17 p.m. Street lamps outside my house pulsed with an almost deliberate rhythm, not quite wind-driven, but calculated. One evening, I walked to the cornfield's edge, searching for any physical trace of the shape I'd seen on television. Dark clouds hung heavy over the flat landscape. I pulled my coat tight, scanning the endless rows of corn, wondering what secrets might be hiding just beyond sight. Peggy remained reluctant to discuss the events. My mother noticed my exhaustion, but accepted my vague explanation about staying up late. Something was happening, and I was determined to understand it. I felt a strange wind that wasn't there before. Something was watching me, like a bird under a branch, waiting for movement. I ran home, heart pounding, convinced shadows moved at the edges of my vision. But every time I turned, nothing was there. The next week, I tried talking to friends about the broadcast. Most said the show looked normal. My cousin Harold laughed nervously, suggesting I'd stared at the TV too long. Only my sister admitted seeing something odd, though she spoke vaguely and quickly changed the subject when our mother walked in. Things got stranger at the local theatre's late newsreel showing. Just before it started, the lights dimmed and the projector skipped. A bright flash appeared. That same metallic outline hovering over cornfields glimpsed through a grainy lens. I jerked in my seat, dropping my coat. People glanced at me, but no one seemed concerned. When I asked my neighbor about the tape, he claimed the reel ran perfectly fine. The shape started a peel ring everywhere. At the county fair, it flickered in the Ferris wheel's reflection. During the church bazaar, a puddle showed a shimmering metallic form hovering over cornfields. Peggy stopped responding to my comments, and even my journal felt inadequate to capture what I was experiencing. Everything peaked one late night driving home from the diner. The main road cut through open farmland under cold, scattered stars. My headlights caught a distant shimmer in the cornfield. I slowed, thinking it might be a deer or scrap metal, but as I approached, the shape shifted, angular, metallic, hovering just above the ground. My engine stalled in my chest. I could barely breathe. Then, with a blink or a momentary glance away, it vanished. No trace remained, not even flattened corn. I drove faster after that, windows up, eyes locked forward, shaking all the way home. Inside, the house felt normal, safe. I was walking down Main Street toward my apartment late one night, probably close to midnight. The town was mostly dark, with a few lights flickering in the windows of the general store and the cafe. That's when I first saw him standing under the street lamp near the post office, watching the street like he belonged there. At first, his presence didn't seem strange. Drifters often passed through town, but something about him caught my eye. His suit looked old, maybe from the 30s, pressed and spotless, as if it had never been worn. His shoes showed no marks, and his coat was buttoned perfectly. In a town where most folks had dust on their boots and frayed collars, he stood out dramatically. He noticed me before I got close, giving me a polite yet deliberate nod. I hesitated, feeling something was off about him. After that night, I didn't mention the encounter, and over time, the events began to fade from conversations. People returned to their ordinary routines, but I couldn't forget. Months later, at a gathering in the town hall, someone laughed about technical difficulties during a broadcast. A chill ran through me. "Which night?" I asked quietly. Nobody remembered anything unusual. Not one flicker, not one metallic shape over the corn. They all described it as ordinary, cheerful, flawless. I started keeping a schedule, noting when and where I saw shadows move oddly, or lights flicker in unexplained patterns. Sometimes I wondered if I was imagining things, straining to see oddities where there were none, but other times I could swear I felt a shape watching, waiting, always just out of reach. Life continued. Peggy married, the diner changed hands, the county fair returned every summer. Yet on quiet nights, when the wind is low and the moon leans pale over the cornfields, I can still see that shape reflected in the dark, hovering perfectly still, metallic, and waiting, as if it were never gone. Even now, in daylight, I sometimes glance at the fields from the car window, thinking I catch a shimmer just at the edge of sight. It never comes closer, never signals, never touches, but it lingers like a question I can't answer, and a broadcast that only some of us ever truly saw, and I don't tell anyone. A stranger approached differently from other drifters I'd encountered. His movements were precise, almost mechanical, scanning the street with an unsettling, calm alertness. "Evening," he said quietly, but clearly, "Could you tell me where I might find Willow Street?" I frowned. Willow Street didn't exist in our town. I've lived here most of my life, surrounded only by maple, pine, and oak trees. "There's no such street here," I explained, trying to keep my voice steady. He smiled slightly, not mockingly, but as if he'd anticipated my response. "I could have sworn it was right past the bakery's intersection," he continued. I shook my head. "No, sir. Bakery remains on Oak Street. Impossible to miss." He nodded, looking down the street as if visualizing something invisible to me. Then he asked about Mr. Serridge. mentioning he lived near Chestnut and Vines's corner. My stomach twisted. Mr. Gib Cage lived 2 streets over. But how could this stranger know his name? No one had mentioned him. Before I could question this, he interrupted himself. "Perhaps I misremember," he said. "I've been on the road so long, everything blurs." The street remained quiet, interrupted only by distant truck sounds. Though he looked ordinary, his movements betrayed something different. He didn't shift or breathe like a normal person. His head turned smoothly, examining buildings and windows with an unnatural precision that suggested deep familiarity. "Maybe I've taken a wrong turn," he finally said. "Could you point me to the center of town?" Feeling oddly childlike, I hesitated before responding. "You're already on Main," I said. "The scent's right down that way." Gesturing vaguely toward the diner and clock tower, he nodded, pausing to look down Main Street, as if trying to recall something. Then he smiled faintly, almost wistfully. "I suppose it doesn't matter," he murmured. "The directions I'm given rarely match the streets I walk." That sentence lingered with me, its peculiarity defying casual explanation. He was off. His words didn't sound natural, like a script read too many times. I stepped back toward my apartment, but something felt wrong. Over my shoulder, he stood motionless under the street lamp, watching. Then came the strange moment. He raised his hand in a small, purposeful wave, not directed at me, but at something invisible. In the days that followed, our paths crossed repeatedly in unexpected places. The grocery store, the town library, the old church at the town's edge. Each encounter brought peculiar questions. Is the Smithson PB Lace still standing? The one with the white picket fence? No one had used that name in years. I was told the train passes here. It should have arrived an hour ago. That the schedule showed no trains for another 3 days. I started documenting these encounters. He never truly interacted with anyone, just asked his cryptic questions. People would glance at him briefly before looking away. His gaze seemed different, always tracking something, just beyond my perception. One foggy night, I found him near the town's edge, past the emerging cornfields. He stood by the railroad tracks, staring into the misty landscape. Curiosity drew me closer. "You shouldn't be here," I whispered. He turned, offering a faint smile. And yet, here I am. His eyes were strange, fixed on a point beyond the fog. "I've been told to wait for the evening light," he said, though the meaning escaped me. The fog thickened between us, and an unsettling silence descended. No dogs, no crickets, no distant train rumble, just absolute quiet. Slowly, deliberately, he began walking along the tracks. I followed at a distance, keeping the road between us and whatever might be trailing behind. After a few minutes, he stopped and looked back. "The path doesn't always appear as you remember," he said, words that sent a chill through me. Here's the rewritten text. "The memory of him lingers like a shadow at the edge of a street lamp, always just beyond reach." I never shared this story with anyone in town or with my family. They would have thought I was crazy. But even now, when fog rolls in and streets empty out, I catch glimpses of him. Sometimes I wonder if he was even human. Maybe he was something else entirely, walking slowly along paths we only think we understand. I can't explain who he was or why he knew impossible things. Names that shouldn't have meant anything to him. Streets that didn't exist. Dome's Tea. He vanished into the fog like the world had simply swallowed him whole. That night on the tracks haunts me. I get the sense he wasn't really waiting for me, but for something else. Something invisible. something that wasn't supposed to be here. I never saw him speak to anyone else. His voice reached me only directly, as if meant for me alone. Late at night on Main Street, I sometimes see that old suit, spotless, pressed, waiting under the street lamp. The town feels suspended, holding its breath. Eventually, I stopped trying to track him. Was he real, or just a trick of fog and quiet streets? I caught fleeting glimpses everywhere. A library shelf's corner, a shadow beneath a street lamp, a shape passing the bakery window, always gone when I looked directly. No one in town had seen him. I asked around, but people had no recollection. By morning, after our encounter, there was no trace, no footprints, no marks in the dirt, not even a lingering scent from his coat. He appeared suddenly that night, turned, and vanished into the fog. Not like someone walking down a street, but completely disappearing. No evidence he had been there at all. Something in his expression stopped me from asking again about the path he mentioned. And so the mystery remains, as elusive as he was. I pulled into the motel lot, gravel grinding under my tires, and went to check in. The room key cost me 75 cents, handed over to an older man in a warm, dark suit who barely acknowledged me. No welcome, just a nod and a brass key, swinging from a string. My room was small and silent, a cot against the wall, a single lamp on the nightstand. I washed up and tried to relax, but something felt off. The highway outside was eerily quiet, with only a faint neon buzz from the window. I drifted to sleep, but something woke me later. Moonlight spread across the floor, and in the doorway stood a man in a dark suit, black suitcase in hand, perfectly still. When I blinked, he vanished. I thought I'd imagined it. But then strange things started happening. Footsteps in the hallway moved with unnatural precision, slow, deliberate, almost floating. Doors would crack open momentarily, a shadow peeking out before disappearing. The timing was impossible. These movements were too quick, too silent to be normal travelers. I got up and checked the window. The parking lot was empty. The office was dark and abandoned. Then I saw them. One by one, figures in identical dark suits and black suitcases drifted through the gravel lot. They moved without speaking, without looking around, as if drawn by some invisible force. I tried counting them, 6, maybe 7 or 8, but the shadows made it difficult to be certain. They all entered the motel, moving with an unsettling synchronicity that sent a chill down my spine. I spent the night tossing and turning, never fully asleep. Soft sounds kept jolting me awake, the whisper of suitcase wheels against wooden floors, the distant creak of a door somewhere down the hallway. When morning came, I tried calling the office, but the phone was dead. The office was empty, coated in a layer of dust that suggested no one had been there for ages. At the registry book, I searched for the names of the men I'd seen arrive the night before. Nothing. Not a single entry. It was as if they had never existed. The other entries looked normal. Names, towns, dates. But these travelers had vanished completely. Even my own signature seemed out of place, looking fresh against the yellowed pages. In the nearby town, I asked around about recent guests at the Greenway Motel. People smiled politely and shrugged. One older man mentioned the motel had been closed for months until recently, which didn't align with my experience. I'd seen the clear, paid him, ND, held a room key in my hand. I left quickly, constantly checking my rear view mirror. Every few miles, I'd spot a figure standing motionless on the roadside, always distant and vague. These shapes would disappear, when I slowed down. By the time I reached my next destination, there was no trace, no footprints, no evidence anyone had been there. I rarely discuss this night. Who would believe a story about silent travelers dressed identically who appeared and vanished without explanation? Sometimes I wonder if it was just a dream born from exhaustion. But then I remember the heavy black suitcases, their pale, expressionless faces illuminated by moonlight, and the eerie silence that seemed alive across the motel lot. Now, whenever I stop at a small motel, I find myself scanning the parking lot, counting cars, watching for anything or anyone standing too still. The night was quiet, the wind still, and I found myself in the barn, a place that had never known anything but ordinary farm sounds. But this night was different. A strange blue glow seeped through the cracks of the weathered wooden door, unlike anything I'd seen before. Not moonlight, not frost, but something else entirely. I'd been running this farm alone since my father passed, and I knew every inch of it. Nothing here glowed. Not the hay, not the tractors, not the animals. But now something was wrong. When I stepped inside, the silence hit me first. The animals were frozen, staring upward with wide, unblinking eyes. No restless movements, no snorts or shuffling, just absolute stillness. My heart raced as I softly called out, "Anybody here?" The word seemed to vanish in the cold air. The metallic scent mixed with the sharp smell of hay, and the blue light now crawled across the floorboards, climbing the barn's wooden posts. These days, I keep driving past the Greenway Road, never slowing down. There is something in those shadows, something watching from empty windows and abandoned buildings. I can't explain it, but I know what I saw. The book never recorded their presence, but that doesn't matter. I keep my eyes on the road and never look back. Sometimes, in the quietest moments, I hear faint sounds, wheels sliding across gravel, carrying secrets just beyond my understanding. Secrets whispered by those who might be holding something black, always just out of sight. The barn was filled with an eerie light that seemed to radiate from the rafters, but nothing was visible up there. No lanterns, no bulbs, not even moonlight catching a beam. Just this strange, heavy quiet that made the air feel thick and oppressive. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. A car reflection. Impossible. The nearest road was over half a mile away, and I hadn't heard any engines. An electrical leak. There was no wiring near the loft, and the old generator had been dead for years. The animals remained perfectly still, their unblinking eyes fixed on something I couldn't see, something beyond my understanding. I grabbed a lantern from the shelf and lit it, hoping the warm glow might cut through the bluish haze. But the light seemed powerless, sitting there in the middle of the barn without touching the source. Shadows stretched long across the floor as I took slow, careful steps. My boots creaked against the wooden boards. The animals didn't move. They felt like they were waiting, anticipating something I couldn't comprehend. Climbing the ladder to the loft, I searched for a better view. The blue glow shimmered in patches along the boards, almost like spilled paint that had started to hum. Or maybe I was imagining the hum. A faint vibration, soft as a distant machine, teased at the edge of my hearing. Then I saw it, a massive shadow within the blue light, taller than Tumon itself, pressing against the boards above. No face, no recognizable features, just a dark shape against the pale glow. It moved slowly, not with purpose, but as if observing the barn from above. The animals remained frozen, unblinking. I realized I hadn't taken a breath in what felt like an eternity. Carefully, I descended the ladder, keeping my eyes locked on the shape. I wanted to run, but where? Not with this silent presence so close. My lantern swung, and for a moment the glow flared against the ceiling. I thought I saw the shapeshift sliding closer to the barn boards, freezing. I tried to rationalize. A trick of light, a shadow, perhaps my mind playing games in the silence. Then the light changed. The blue shimmer pulsed. The barn's interior shifted subtly. A soft blue light dimming and brightening, almost imperceptibly. Something watched from above, though no clear shape remained. The animals blinked in an almost synchronized movement as the glow retreated with a slow, measured rhythm. I stepped outside to catch my breath, the cold night air sharp against my skin. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined everything. But when I looked back, the barn's outline stood stark against the darkness, and thin streams of blue light still seeped through its cracks. No sounds disturbed the stillness. The animals remained motionless, and an unseen presence continued to watch me as I backed towards the house. I tried rationalizing the experience. A strange reflection, moonlight playing tricks, perhaps some unknown fungal glow in the damp air. But deep down, I knew this was something beyond explanation. That night, I sat in the farmhouse, pipe in hand, watching the barn window. The blue light pulsed and flickered, seeming to breathe with its own strange rhythm. Shadows occasionally danced just beyond the frosted glass. I didn't dare go back outside. Morning breaks ought normally. Sunlight washed over the barn, and the animals returned to their typical routines, looing, scratching, clucking as if nothing unusual had occurred. I meticulously searched every inch of the space, finding no evidence of the previous night's strange phenomenon. No footprints, no scorch marks, nothing to validate what I'd witnessed. The animals, though seemingly unperturbed, would occasionally glance toward the rafters, a subtle reminder that something lingered in their memory. I tried convincing myself it was a dream, a hallucination born from exhaustion and long, cold nights. Days passed. I continued my farm work, keeping the barn doors tightly closed. But sometimes, when the wind swept across the fields or sunlight struck at just the right angle, a faint blue flicker would catch my eye. The animals would look up, their gaze knowing, suggesting they hadn't forgotten either. Something had happened. Something remained. The summer evening at Lake Wanola started like any other family picnic in 1957. We'd spread our blanket near the birch trees with a clear view of the sky. Clara Ara had packed sandwiches, hard-boiled eggs, and lemonade. Henry, 9 years old, kept trying to skip stones across the water, while 6-year-old Ruth lay on her back, watching the stars. The lake was peaceful. A few fishermen dotted the far side of the water, and occasional screen doors banged shut from nearby cabins. The air held the last warmth of the day, with early stars beginning to peek through the darkening sky. I was leaning back on my elbows when something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was a cloud, but something felt different. Above us, a triangular shape blocked out a patch of stars. Its edges were unnaturally sharp, unlike anything I'd seen before. No lights, no sound, just a vast dark form moving slowly and steadily across the sky. "Do you see that?" "I don't," asked Clara Ara, pointing upward. She looked at me confused. "See what that?" I said, tracing the outline. "It's covering the stars." She squinted and shook her head. Years later, in the farmhouse, I'd still think about that night. Something had changed. The animals seemed different, always looking up, always watching. In the quiet evenings, I'd hear a faint hum beneath the floorboards or high in the rafters. Shadows would stretch in ways they shouldn't, not moving, just watching. I stopped going to the loft after that night. I keep a lantern by the door just in case. I still do my chores, feeding animals, sweeping floors. The barn looks normal. Everything looks normal. But when night falls and the wind cuts across the fields, I know the blue light isn't gone. It's waiting, watching. I can't explain what happened. I don't know what it was, but I know it was real. And the animals know it too. I stared up at the sky, my eyes fixed on something massive hovering above the birch trees. It moved so slowly that at first you could barely notice its progression. Half the visible stars were blocked by this enormous shape, creeping almost imperceptibly across the night sky. I rubbed my eyes, but it was still there. "Look," I said to Henry and Ruth, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can't you see it?" Henry tilted his head back, chewing his lip. "Just stars, Daddy," he mumbled. Ruth was busy tying grass blades into knots, barely glancing up. Clara gave me a half smile, the kind you give someone you think might be joking. The shape wasn't just a vague outline anymore. As it drifted closer, I could almost make out an uneven texture. It swallowed stars, one by one, revealing others on its opposite side. Eerily. There was no sound, no engine, no wind, just complete silence. The fishermen on the lake continued casting their lines, seemingly unaware of the massive object. Oh, Reed. My chest tightened as I tried to explain what I was seeing. I pointed out its movement, how it covered the stars, but the more I talked, the more uneasy everyone became. Ruth asked to go home. Henry insisted I was making it up, but the thing kept drifting, slowly, angling toward the far side of the lake. I tracked its path as it passed over the fishermen's boats. Not a single head turned. Then it crossed beyond the ridge of trees and vanished. Suddenly, the stars were clear and sharp again, filling the sky. I sat waiting for something more to happen, but nothing did. Just the chirping of crickets and the gentle lapping of water. Clara looked at me with a concern that made my stomach twist. It wasn't annoyance, but a genuine worry, like she thought I might be ill. I hadn't even touched the lemonade, let alone anything stronger. Yet no one else had seen what I'd witnessed. It was 1953, and I was 23, working the late shift at the South Mill. Most nights, I caught the midnight bus home after the taverns had closed and the streets had gone quiet. That particular evening, I arrived at the main street stop a few minutes early. The fog was so dense, I couldn't even see the courthouse clock across the square. Only one other person sat on the bench when I got there. He wore a suit that seemed too refined for our town. Not flashy, just impeccably tailored. Dark jacket, crisp trousers, and shoes that gleamed even in the weak street light. He sat upright, hands folded neatly over his knee, looking like he was waiting for an important interview. I gave him a polite nod and sat a little ways down. Having company at the stop felt unusual. He spoke first, his voice calm and steady. He asked if I worked at the mill, and when I confirmed I was at the South Mill, he began a series of precise questions. His inquiries weren't typical small talk. Instead of casual conversation, he asked about workforce numbers, operational hours, and machinery activity. His language was different from locals, where we might ask about whistle volumes or pay rates. He used phrases like, "How much energy do they expend?" and At what hours is the machinery most active? Something about his questioning felt methodical, as if he were collecting specific information. When I tried to learn about him, he deflected. He claimed he was just passing through, wanting to understand the town's activity. I chuckled and remarked that there wasn't much happening after dark except in the factories. He didn't share my humor, just nodded as if I'd confirmed something important. As we talked, the fog seemed to thicken. Street lamps created small yellow cones of light. Ruth tugged Clara Ara's sleeve, asking for another cookie. The world continued, as if nothing unusual had occurred. The ride home was silent. I didn't mention anything, and neither did they. But I know what I saw that night. A black triangle, massive and silent, blotting out half the sky. And I'll never understand why I was the only one who could see it. It was 1957, and I was 17. Nights back then were long and restless in our small town. Me, Robert Evans, his cousin, June, and Larry Peters would drive the back roads outside of town simply because there wasn't much else to do. Robert had just gotten his father's old Plymouth running again, and that beat-up car represented everything we wanted: freedom. We'd taken County Road 12, a lonely stretch that cuts through the woods and stays mostly empty after sundown. The night was dark, with a thin moon hiding behind clouds, and the air carried a damp smell that hinted at coming rain. The bus stop was deserted when I encountered him. The street didn't stretch far, and I couldn't even see the store windows behind us. We sat on a bench that felt like it was placed in the middle of nowhere. After a few minutes, he stood up abruptly. No coat, no hat, just a perfectly pressed suit. He smoothed his sleeve and looked down the street as if expecting someone, then turned back to me. "I must be going," he said. I mentioned the bus wasn't due for another 5 minutes, but he shook his head. "No, my time is elsewhere." Without another word, he stepped off the curb and walked straight across the road into the fog. I thought he might live nearby, though I knew the other side of the bus stop was nothing but an open field. I expected him to angle toward a side street or head for one of the distant houses. Instead, he kept walking directly into the field, the mist swallowing him completely until he vanished. I remained seated, staring after him. The sound of his shoes on the pavement faded quickly, and then there was nothing. No footsteps, no movement, just silence. When the bus arrived, the driver opened the door and remarked that I looked pale. I asked if he'd seen another man waiting earlier. "You're the only soul I've seen tonight," he replied. During the ride home, I kept thinking about that suit, perfectly pressed, without a single speck of dust or wrinkle. I couldn't understand why a man dressed so immaculately would be asking questions about factories in a town nobody pays attention to. The field he walked into stretches flat for a good half-mile before reaching the river. Even in the fog, you'd expect to see some shape or movement, but there was nothing. He went in and simply disappeared. I continued taking the midnight bus after that night, but I never saw him again. The night was quiet as we drove down a deserted road, the radio barely audible. Robert was at the wheel, Larry next to him, with June and me in the back. Suddenly, June leaned forward, her finger pointing beyond the trees. "Do you see that?" At first I thought she meant deer, but Robert slowed down and we all looked up. There it was, a strange light hovering above the tree-eye. It wasn't like a star or a plane. This was different. No blinking, no typical movement, just a soft, wide glow that seemed to float effortlessly defying explanation. Robert brought the car to a stop on the shoulder. We sat in stunned silence, studying this inexplicable phenomenon. The light had an unusual green tint, pulsing almost like it was breathing. Then something bizarre happened. The engine died. Robert tried the key repeatedly, muttering about the battery, but nothing worked. Without warning, the radio crackled to life. But this wasn't the country station we'd been listening to. The music was unlike anything we'd heard before. Modern, electric, with a beat that felt completely out of place. In 1957, a bright, layered voice sang over an unfamiliar rhythm that seemed to come from another time. Larry looked confused. What station is this? Robert frantically twisted the dial, but the music continued, growing louder with each attempt. June whispered what we were all thinking. That doesn't sound like anything I've heard before. The strange light began to move, sliding across the sky with an impossible smoothness. No sound, no jerky motion, just a steady, unnatural glide. When it tilted, the car's interior suddenly filled with an eerie green light, casting an otherworldly glow on our faces and surroundings. In that moment, we knew something extraordinary was happening, something that defied everything we understood about the world. The night was 1954, and I was running a modest farm a few miles outside of Stillwater, Oklahoma. 200 acres of wheat and a handful of cattle were all I had. Nights out there were quiet, so quiet you could hear the wind shift or a screen door slam from a mile away. I'd gone to bed early. Nothing out of the old diner, just another night before a sunrise full of work. But something woke me. Not a sound I could pinpoint, just that unsettling feeling when you sense something's off. The air felt thick, still, almost heavy. We were driving when it happened. The radio grew louder, nearly rattling the speakers. A song played, its words twisted and incomprehensible like English, but warped somehow. The singer repeated a phrase I couldn't quite grasp. By the time the song ended, the memory had already slipped away. A light pulled higher, rising above the tree line until it vanished into the clouds. The moment it disappeared, the radio cut to static, sharp and hollow. Robert tried the ignition again, and the car roared back to life as if nothing had happened. We drove in silence. Larry kept glancing out the window. June sat pressed against the door, staring at her hands. Robert gripped the wheel tightly. None of us wanted to acknowledge what we'd seen, not directly. When Robert dropped me home, the porch light looked strange, dimmer somehow. The yard felt altered, like something had leaned close and stepped back just before my arrival. At school the next day, we passed each other in the hallways, nodding, but saying nothing. Years later, when music began to change, electric rhythms and sharper voices emerging, I recognized fragments of that song. Not exactly the same, but close enough to stir the memory. What remained wasn't the light, the dead engine, or even the song itself. It was the car's feeling, when that glow filled it, like we were hearing something not yet meant for us, something that had slipped through from somewhere ahead. The morning was thick with fog, drifting low across the fields in a way that was unusual. Normally this dense mist stayed closer to the river, but today it hung differently. From my bedroom window, I spotted a strange glow through the haze. Not moonless height, but something sharper and more deliberate. I watched, transfixed, as the pale white light hovered above the wheat, moving with an almost liquid quality. Brightness would fade, then intensify, creating an unsettling dance across the landscape. Something compelled me to investigate. Pulling on my boots, I stepped outside into the eerie silence. Duke, my dog, remained on the porch, an oddity in itself. Typically, he'd bark at the slightest disturbance, but now he sat motionless, ears pressed flat, watching me with an uncharacteristic stillness. As I crossed the yard, the glow seemed to dim, as if responding to my approach. By the time I reached the wheat field, it had vanished completely. What remained stopped me in my tracks. A perfect circle, roughly 30 feet across, cut into the wheat with impossible precision. The wheat stalks were flattened and darkened, not burned in a traditional sense, but pressed flat with blackened bases. This wasn't like any lightning strike I'd ever seen. Those were chaotic, splintered, unpredictable. This was deliberate, almost surgical in its execution. At the far edge of the circle, a figure emerged from the fog, tall and lean, wearing a long coat that brushed his boots. He stood impossibly still. For a moment, I thought it might be a neighbor, but his posture was too rigid, too intentional. "Hello there," I called, my voice breaking the heavy silence. No response came. Instead, he slowly lifted his hand, tipping the brim of a hat I hadn't initially noticed. The gesture was calm, almost courteous. Then, with steady, measured steps, he turned and walked into the fog, disappearing as if he'd never existed. Something deep inside me whispered not to follow. It wasn't fear in the traditional sense, not the kind that makes you run, but a profound sense of something beyond my understanding. Duke wed low from the porch, like he sensed something was off. I didn't sleep that night, and when the sun rose, the fog lifted to reveal the circle in the wheat field, clearer than ever. Sharp edges cut through the field like a ruler line, with wheat pressed flat in a single spiraled direction. Earl, my neighbor, stopped by later that morning to borrow a wrench. He stood at the circle's edge, chewing tobacco slowly. His words rang hollow. Wind will do strange things. But he wouldn't step inside, just spat in the dirt and changed the subject. Over the next days, I checked the circle constantly. The wheat never recovered, staying pressed down and lifeless while the surrounding field grew tall and green. No animals ventured near it. Even Duke gave it a wide berth, circling far away when chasing rabbits. What haunted me wasn't the circle itself, but the figure who had been there. His gesture of tipping his hat felt like a silent acknowledgement, as if we shared some unspoken understanding. He hadn't threatened me or vanished dramatically, just a calm, quiet nod before walking into the fog. I never saw him again. By harvest, the circle had turned yellow and dry, its stalks brittle and breaking underfoot. The rest of the field yielded normally, but this patch remained dead. I ploughed it under with the rest. Yet the next year, a faint, darker, thinner outline remained visible. I didn't discuss it much. Small towns have their stories, and I knew better than to add mine. But every time I walked that field, my mind would return to the man at the circle's edge, tipping his hat before disappearing into the fog. We pulled into the diner just after midnight. A squat building hugged the highway, its long windows and buzzing neon sign marking our stop. Pete and I had been driving most of the night, and my eyes were blurring against the endless white lines. He suggested coffee, and I readily agreed. Gravel crunchy under our tires as we pulled into the empty lot with just one old Ford parked nearby. The diner was crooked, tilting near the roadside. Its lights hummed too brightly for the late hour as we climbed out, stretched our stiff backs, and pushed through the glass door with its small silver handle. Quiet enveloped the space, broken only by a distant fan spinning near the ceiling. A dark jukebox stood in the corner, and scattered crumbs across the booth suggested recent patrons had just left. Behind the counter, a woman in her 40s looked up from wiping mugs. Her hair was tied back, her face kind but weary. Evening. She greeted us with a smile that suggested we weren't the first late-night travelers she'd seen. We slid onto counter stools that squeaked under our weight. Pete cleared his throat. 2 coffees, he said. She nodded, reaching for the pot and pouring. Burnt bean aroma filled the air, sharp but welcome after hours of driving. I wrapped my hands around the mug, absorbing its warmth. "You boys headed west?" she asked. Pete confirmed with a simple yeah. She nodded, studying us quietly. Then she leaned closer, her eyes shifting between us as if weighing something. Calm as a discussion about the weather, she asked, "Did you see them too?" Pete's brow furrowed. "See who?" I interjected, but she offered no explanation. Instead, she gave that same knowing smile and disappeared through the swinging kitchen door, which flapped once and fell silent. We sat motionless, steam rising from our untouched mugs. The clock ticked softly overhead. Something had changed. The atmosphere felt different, colder, emptier. I found myself staring at the kitchen entrance, noticing an unnatural silence. No dishes clinking, no water running, just absolute quiet. "Maybe she's making more coffee," Pete muttered unconvincingly. After waiting 5 more minutes with no sign of purr, he stood and approached the kitchen door. Its hinges squeaked as he pushed it open and stepped inside. He returned moments later, shaking his head. "Nobody's there," he said. The kitchen was cold, dark, with only stacked boxes visible. I laughed nervously, the sound thin and uncertain in the strange, empty diner. The highway stretched black and empty behind us, silent except for our boots crunching on gravel. We just left a diner that felt strange beyond words. The kitchen was completely bare. Dusty shelves, swept floor, no trace of recent cooking. Yet we'd both seen the woman carry a pot through that door minutes earlier. Our coffee mug still steamed on the counter, dark liquid looking freshly poured. The neon sign buzzed weakly, casting a sickly pink glow across the room. Something felt off, but neither of us could explain it. We finished our coffees without speaking. The clock ticked, and the silence seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. When we stood to leave, I noticed something peculiar about the mugs, maybe the steam rising too slowly, or how the liquid didn't move when I set mine down. Hours earlier, I'd seen something odd over the eastern fields, a pale glow moving too smoothly to be a plane, too steady for a lantern. I hadn't mentioned it then, thinking my eyes were playing tricks. Now, watching Pete grip the steering wheel and stare intensely at the road, I wondered if he'd seen it too. We didn't stop again that night. We never returned to that diner. Back home, the children played in the cornfields at dusk, laughing and blinking like a string of lanterns. I was at the sink, screen door propped open, when Tommy burst onto the porch. He looked like any boy after a long chase. Flushed cheeks, sweaty hair, but something was different. His pallidness wasn't normal. Pete broke the silence in the truck. "You think she was asking about tea lights?" he said. I didn't answer immediately, lost in thought about what we just experienced. "Ah," he gasped. "There's a man in the corn." "Who's with you?" I asked, "because you say that out of habit. Who's with you? What did you do?" And he didn't answer for a second. His eyes were fixed on the field as if it might still be there. He said Roger and Elsie ran to the house. He asked us. He asked me what year it was. What did you tell him? I set the dish down and felt the water chill. Tommy's voice went very small. I told him he said it twice like he'd forgotten. He swallowed. The man was tall and white, pale, like he had no colour. He wore a hat like Mr. Hargreaves used to wear, like a fedora. Mary came out from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. She saw Tommy's face and the way he kept looking over my shoulder, and went still. What about the others? She said. Tommy answered that they ran. Elsie screamed when she saw him. He didn't shout or anything. He just said, "What year is it?" and smiled. We looked at each other the way you do when something small has gone wrong, and you were trying to find the sensible place to put it. The light had that thin quality right after the sun drops. The corn rusted to a darker green. The fireflies beginning again. I put my cap on and grabbed the lantern from the porch rail. "Stay here," Mary said to the children, though she didn't sound as sure as the words were supposed to be. I stepped into the field and took the rose lantern held out, so the light made a pale trail on the stalks. The corn husks whispered against each other. The faint smell of river muck and the general late summer sweat of everything out there filled my nose. I called, "Hello, Lo," the way you do when the place is supposed to be empty. My voice came back thin. The place where Tommy and the others said they'd been was a little wedge of flattened cow by the second row. The stalks lay like a small hand had smoothed them. It wasn't a big patch, only a few paces, but the way they bent was wrong. Neat, not trampled. You could still see the dew on the leaves, and there were no footprints to speak of in the lawn. When I knelt down, the dirt was dry on the surface, not like it's been pushed around by boots. There was a faint smear on the leaf, something like dust in a light crescent. I walked the rows for a while, calling the children's names. The sound of the lantern came back to me, as if I were far away. The fireflies made a patchwork behind me, and a beetle clicked. The field stretched out, quiet and still. That night, the children had been agitated, their voices rising and falling. Mary tried to calm them, urging them inside to wash their hands. I retreated to the house, sensing something was off. Roscoe, our dog, stood at the field's edge near the old fence, his ears alert. He barked once and refused to enter the grass, unusual for him. My sister started spinning ghost stories, but the kids insisted they'd seen something. Her grainness settled over the evening. In the kitchen, Mary prepared tea, setting the kettle to simmer. The small radio on the icebox hummed softly, playing the farm report. I held my cup, unable to shake the memory of that man's voice. Calm, measured, with a pause that suggested he was searching for words. The next morning, I walked out to investigate. The field showed a flattened wedge, cornstalks lying neat as a tucked-in sheet. I ran my fingers through the dirt. No tracks. When the children told Mr. Bailey next door, he came down, frowning, his hat in hand. Strange occurrences began to accumulate. Old Joe's son claimed someone was watching from the porch. Mrs. Abernathy's hens fell silent at dusk. The church bell rang twice during morning prayers and then went silent. My wristwatch, I'd owned for years, suddenly gained 10 minutes overnight before correcting itself. 3 days after the boys' experience, Elsie saw the man again, while carrying milk pails. She described him standing at the fence, leaning on a post as if he'd been there all afternoon. He stared directly at her without blinking. Terrified, she ran, her voice trembling as she recounted the encounter. That evening, I drove out with a better lantern and a neighbor's shotgun, more as a precaution than with any real expectation of using it. I'm not one to believe in omens, but when a watch starts behaving strangely, you take notice. The sky had turned the color of a tin roof, and the cornstalks made the same rustle in the wind. I stopped the truck at the edge of the field and stepped out, scanning the ditch's corner. A pale line seemed to flicker between the stalks, but when I walked closer, nothing remained, just blades of grass, earth's scent, and my boots disturbing the soil. That evening, we left the kitchen light burning and the children's doors open. Roscoe lay at my feet as I sat in the rocking chair, lamp dim, listening to the house's quiet breathing. Suddenly, a faint sound emerged, like a distant metronome's rhythm, not from a car, train, or animal. It lasted a moment and vanished. When I mentioned it to Mary, she dismissed it casually. "Probably some switch, Frank," she said, draping a quilt over the sleeping children. I wanted to probe deeper, but the familiar comfort of everyday objects surrounded me. Dishes, the wall calendar, curtains catching streetlight. A week passed, and strange whispers began circulating in town. Mrs. Klein at the post office claimed letters mysteriously slid to the floor without any breeze. Hank from the Creary reported clocks behaving oddly, one stubbornly stopping at 4 until extra winding. People spoke of an unusual pale band in the sky over the river, mentioning it with the detached tone of someone describing a distant memory. I caught another glimpse late one night, a tall, pale figure in the hollow near the old oak. But when I approached with my lantern, it disappeared completely. I asked Simpson at the feed store if he'd seen anyone. He simply shook his head. Passing the field's corner became a moment of held breath, as if waiting for something undefined to align. The children's initial fear gradually transformed. Tommy still glances toward the cornfield occasionally, like a man remembering an old familiar road. Mary tells me not to worry, but something lingers in the edges of memory, just beyond understanding. Night falls, and I'm more careful now. The locks get checked, and the lamp stays by the door a little longer than before. Not that I'm sharing much with anyone. People have enough on their minds already. Back in 1950, Tommy and I were just boys killing time on the county road, bikes singing with each turn of the spokes. We'd wander farther into the fields than our mothers would approve. That day, we found ourselves sliding through a hedge gap we'd never noticed, crossing a little rise into a clearing I'd glimpsed once from a hilltop. It was like a green bowl ringed by trees, perfectly ordinary, until we saw the blankets spread smooth on the grass, a neat red and white checked square with everything laid out just so. An enamel teapot, 2 cups, plates with bread and cold meat, a jar of preserves. Steam rose in thin white ropes, which was odd given the cold north wind cutting through our shirts. No tracks led to the picnic, no footprints, no bicycle marks. The ground around the blanket looked untouched, as if the meal had simply appeared. The cups were steaming. The meat looked freshly placed. Tommy and I exchanged that look, the one you give when you know something's no tea. Quite right, but you're not sure why. Everything was precise. Salt and pepper shakers, a small knife, a folded napkin, all perfectly clean and positioned. I reached out, nervous, and touched near the teapot spout. The metal was warm enough that the steam had to be real. Tommy broke the silence, his voice too loud in the meadow. Maybe someone's hiding. Maybe it was a man who lost his way, or a trick of light, or some strange joke. When dusk comes, and fireflies start, and our boy wants to stay out just a minute longer, I keep my eye on the corn. Sometimes you learn that not everything fits neatly, so you fold your hands and move on. We called out the two of a prank. Old Harrow's grandsons, maybe. Hello. The sound drifted into the trees, and silence answered. No voices, no footfalls, birds rustled the hedgerow, and I told myself that was all. We sat down, because sometimes sitting is the only thing you can do. Our teacups steamed with bitter liquid, nothing like Clara Ara's sweet brew. Warm, at least. Bread in hand. We listened. My watch read 4:15. Tommy's just a tick different. Time felt strange, long and short, all at once. The sun hung comfortably above the trees, keeping the meadow bright. Tommy discovered a scrap of paper under a plate. For two, it read in careful script. No name, no context, just those two words. Sensible people would have left. We didn't. Tommy wanted to check who might be watching, so we moved to the tree line. Something silver caught my eye first. A flash above the oaks. It rose slowly, sliding like a coin through the air. Not a plane, no engine sound, no trail. It moved with impossible grace, laughing silently at the wind. The object glided on a level path, then vanished into a cloud bank as if slipping behind the sky's hem. When it disappeared, the meadow felt different, thinner, like someone had stripped a wool blade and Kate away. Tommy swore quietly. Did you see that? His face wasn't excited like at a circus. He looked haunted, like a man hearing an unexplained noise in an empty house. We stood with the hedgerow behind us, teapot steam fogging around us. 40 minutes of searching yielded only bird songs and creek branch whispers. Our original path remained, but no other tracks appeared. Strangely, the grass near our blanket stayed dry where steam rose. The air briefly tasted of metal. Then, nothing. My thoughts were static, unfocused. Walking back to the road, Tommy muttered about being watched, not by someone hidden, but by the meadow itself, as if the land was paying attention to something at its center. I laughed, stubborn always. We walked back slow, and by the time we reached the county road, a blankness had settled into the center of my chest. I said nothing on the bikes. The hedgerow shut the meadow from us like a lid. The world went to the business of ordinary things. Livestock glowed in the distance, a tractor coughing somewhere past Mr. Benton's. At home, I told Ma about the picnic, because that's what you do with small oddities. Tell someone who will call you sensible. She was wiping the table and stopped mid-wipe. There's no picnic planned anywhere near here, she said, her fingers going white on the rag. I suggested it was probably a lark, a picnic left by gypsies or hobos. She gave me a look like I'd put sugar in the salt jar. Don't go back there, Sam, she said, folding her hands around the rag until her knuckles shone. I kept thinking about the silver thing. In the light, it had been pale as tin, flat, more like a disc than any bird I'd ever seen. It had no tail, no wings I could pick, and when it slid into cloud, there was no sound. Even now, I can't explain why nothing in the sky mentioned it afterward. The clouds didn't billow. They swallowed it whole. The tea evening, the street was quiet, and Tom's father called Tommy home early. We didn't meet again that night. I lay awake with the taste of bitter tea in my mouth. Once or twice, I thought I could hear the soft hiss of steam, like a kettle left to itself. The next day, we walked out with ropes and a couple of boards. Tommy wanted proof, wanted to take home a bit of the cheese to show at school. The spot in the meadow was empty. The grass lay flat where the blanket had been, but there were no crumbs, no saucer, no steam stains. The soil looked as if nothing had been there at all. The boards we carried felt useless in our hands, like tools for chores that didn't belong. We told boys at school, and they laughed at first. Then Frank Weaver said his uncle had seen lights over the moor at dusk that week. A woman down in town swore she'd found a small ring of scorched earth when she'd gone to gather mushrooms. A mechanic at the garage said his dog had refused to go out at night for 2 nights. We were dreamers, they said. But the memory lingered like a whisper, refusing to fade. Every week that passed settled back into routine. Mowing lawns, helping Ma with groceries, spending evenings at the shop with Tommy, and the men swapping baseball tales. Yet something remained, tucked away in the corner of my mind. The silver thing haunted me softly. When the sky flattened and streetlights hummed, a small ache would surface. Months later, I dreamed of a steaming plate, cutlery aligned with military precision. I woke tasting bitter tea, smelling clean metal. Mornings brought self-doubt. I'd tell myself how foolish the whole thing seemed, but some experiences defy neat explanations. They insist on staying strange, refusing to be neatly filed away. We never discovered who left the blanket. The silver shape vanished. The meadow remained unchanged. The hedgerow just a hedgerow, yet so me times walking past that spot, now grown wilder since that summer. I swear the grass still flattens momentarily like a breath held and released. That scrap of paper haunted me for 2, it had said simply, and the steam rising from the teapot while no one watched. It was 1950. The night watch at Burlington Railard beyond the mill had been my job for nearly 8 years. Some called it quiet work, that the yard kept a man alert. Rails and oil created their own rhythm. Couplers clanked. Distant engines breathed their sleeping soul. I knew those tracks like a farmer knows his fence posts. My brass lantern, slightly clouded from cold smoke, was my constant companion. Its wick I tended carefully, almost lovingly. Every night at 11, I'd leave the tower, walking a complete loop, checking derails, greasing points, making notes to call old Tom in the tower. If anyone caused trouble on the cars or a switch slipped, they'd hear me, and they knew exactly who to blame. That night, the sky hung low. The yard was iron grey, stripped of its usual smells by a sudden wind. Diesel, tar, wet wood, nothing out of the ordinary had marked the log that day. A local freight rolled in at dusk, leaving a string of empties on the north lead. Just another routine evening. But something felt off. The dogs, usually yapping and prowling the fence line, had gone completely silent. It was as if someone had ordered them to stay quiet. That unnatural stillness settled in my chest like a cold weight. Past midnight, I discovered the first strange thing. Stopping at the north lead, I set my lantern on a car step to oil a hinge. Earlier, a freight had been pushed back here, and the cars sat in a neat line, motionless as sleeping men. Then I saw movement, a ripple between the cars, like a cat slipping through shadows. When I straightened, lamp in hand, a man was walking along the trackside. He wasn't the typical Railard visitor. Dark suit, hat pulled low, shoes too pristine for a labourer. No bag, no belongings. His walk was steady, unbothered, almost purposeful. I called out with my standard hobo warning voice, "Who's there?" No response. The man continued walking, shoulders squared, under the moonless sky. He didn't even glance my way. At first I thought he might be a hitchhiker, left behind by the cars, but his clothing screamed office or bank, not freight yard. Lifting my lantern, I swung the beam across him. The light strobed along the car number plates, casting his shadow long and thin. But where he should have been, there was only the wet gleam of the rail and a brief, strange warmth in the air, as if the night itself had shifted. Then he was simply gone. No footsteps, no rustling cloth, no dust cloud, nothing. The only evidence was a lingering heat on my palm where I'd raised the lantern. I squared my shoulders and walked after him, the tracks moaning metallically beneath my feet, a low grumble like a full stomach. I stood in the middle of the track, scanning the north spur with my lantern. The steel rails where he'd been standing felt wrong. I put my gloved hand close and pulled back immediately. The metal radiated an unnatural heat. Rails are cold at night in winter, but this was like hovering near a stove. I called Tom in the tower. He's seen 1,000 odd things in his time and tells stories with the practiced ease of a baker rolling dough. "Tom," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "come down and look at the north lead. Something's hot." Minutes later, he emerged with his wrench and cap, grumbling about late engine lines and cold tea. His walk was careful, balanced like someone navigating oily steps. He ran his hand along the rail and frowned. That particular look he gets when something doesn't quite align. "That's warm," he said. "My year." Tertifactly, as if discovering a small error in a manifest, we methodically checked everything. Sleepers, bolts, fish plates, solid, no scorched ties, no visible fire. Yet the steel itself steamed our gloves with its heat, our breath coming in quick, short strokes. A faint scent of burned iron hung in the air, sharp as a struck horseshoe. Tom studied the track, searching for some explanation. "Might have been a hot box earlier," he muttered. "An axle sticking. Maybe a train passed through." But his watch confirmed no scheduled train for this spur. We walked the length of the lead, and every rail we touched carried that strange warmth, fading like a sun's lingering touch as we moved away. I almost laughed at myself, wanting to believe it was just a trick of light, a lantern's glow, or a coat's flash playing with my perception. But the rails had been worn. And later, when Tom described what he'd felt, his voice was careful, not boastful, but measured, as if precise speech might offer some protection. We logged it precisely. 1210 North Lead. Unknown person observed. Between cars, the rails were warm. I didn't bother the dispatcher about the quiet shift. The yard was small, a place where word travelled fast. In the carts and lunchroom, talk was hushed and quick. A strange sighting here, an odd warmth there. Nobody laughed too loud. That night, I went out for another lap. My lantern burned low. I kept expecting to see the figure again, to catch his sleeve, or hear his shoes on the gravel. Nothing but cars, and the night's cold surrounded me. On my second pass by the old loading ramp, a low, steady humming caught my attention. It was faint, like a machine, idling just beyond sight. This sound had nothing to do with the locomotives resting nearby. The big diesels were still silent in their sleep. The hum raised goosebumps on my arms. At the bridge, I set my lantern on the rail, watching its reflection. The beams split the darkness cleanly. In one half, I thought I saw a man standing at the yard's far end, hat tilted, looking back at me. I waved like an idiot, waving to a stranger in the night. The figure remained motionless. Then, in a blink, the lantern's light revealed nothing at all. A heavy, raw quiet settled around me. I finished my rounds and locked the gate at 4 rugs, the metal's heat lingering on my wrist like a whispered secret. At first, I said nothing to my wife. She was already worried about the baby and bills. When I finally shared the story, she cupped my face and said I'd been breathing creosote too long. The sleep mustn't be too deep, she warned, making me tea and telling me to leave the log alone. The next evening, I returned with a new lantern and clean pad, hoping daylight would explain the previous night's strangeness. The rails felt normal, cold, and predictable, as they'd been for years. The yard's usual bustle resumed, and the men in the bullpen whispered over coffee, dismissing the night's heat as a cigarette-induced hallucination. I can't explain the warmth, the man in the dark suit, or the humming air. I can only tell you what I did. I kept the log. I told old Tom I made my rounds with a steady lantern, and I slept with the window cracked, afraid of being in a room that didn't match what I'd witnessed. I pause now when making my rounds at the bend of the north, my palm hovering near the rail. The metal always feels cool, yet at a certain hour of the night, when the air settles heavily over the yard like a thick blanket, I sense a fleeting memory of heat along the steel, as if something massive had just been lifted away. A hollow remains that I can't quite fill. My gaze lingers down the line, waiting for a shadow to slip between the cars and a man in a dark suit to emerge from the night's darkness. During the hymn, the lights suddenly dipped. I recall the exact moment because Mrs. Clark had just finished a musical phrase, and the congregation continued singing the final line. The church was unusually full that day. Men wore their Sunday best, women sported elegant hats, and teenagers huddled in the back, struggling to suppress their giggles. Reverend Jameson's sermon lay open on the pulpit, discussing charity and steadiness, topics that typically prompt knowing nods. Noon sunlight streamed through the high chancel window, cutting dust into pale boards. Then the bulbs flickered, and the chandeliers hummed deeply, drawing the current. Everything went grey for a moment, with the organ holding a single fragile sound. The hymn dissolved in that empty space. Murmurs rose. A child began to cry. The church clock, its big brass face above the entrance, ticked twice and stopped like a sudden intake of breath. The lights returned quickly, strobing to near normally. A tiny electric fear crept along my arms, that unsettling sense that something in the house wasn't quite right. Reverend Jameson glanced upward, the way preachers sometimes assess a room's atmosphere, and when he looked back, a faint grey line marked his face, something I'd never seen before. Just after the organ resumed, a sound from outside made 20 people in the nave turn simultaneously. It wasn't a truck or a typical mechanical noise. This sound resonated within bones, a prolonged pitched note that hung suspended above the rooftop. More than a simple hum, it carried a complex tone with both high and low frequencies, pressing against the thin window panes like an unseen presence. Some congregation members stiffened. Older men clutched their hymnals as if they were lifelines, their grips tight with an unspoken tension. The morning had been strange from the start. The church bell rang twice before its usual time, a quick bright note that stopped short of the sexton's typical count. Old Mr. Hargreaves noticed his cattle standing in an unusual neat ring, all facing the same direction. Mary Keller Tuller's radio had spoken in static, a thin mechanical whisper with no music while she set the table. When I reached the vestry to prepare the hymnals, I found them neatly arranged, but one hymn number bore a smudged ink mark, as if someone had hastily run their hand across it. These were the kinds of small oddities people in a small town typically shrug off. Then came the hum. It lasted perhaps 10 seconds, though it felt much longer. The organist's fingers froze on the keys. Reverend Jameson's mouth hung open mid-sentence. The wall clock stood perfectly still. When the sound dropped, it left the church feeling somehow smaller. People leaned forward, listening as the sound faded into ordinary town noises. A distant hammer, the clink of glass from Jennings' store. Reverend Jameson closed his sermon and apologized, but his words seemed directed at an absent congregation. Mrs. Clark mentioned seeing a flicker through the east window near the steeple, perhaps a plane's reflection. Pastor Jameson suggested it was just an electrical hiccup or a passing train's vibration. The teenagers suppressed their snickers after being hushed. After the service, people gathered in the churchyard as usual, trading words and planning lunch. The sky was clear and sunlight turned the steeple into a pale spear. While discussing the bazaar with Ruth Mason, I overheard a man's flat question. "Did you see it?" A murmur followed. Ruth blinked. "See what by the steeple?" the man repeated. Something had shifted. The day had taken a breath it wasn't meant to take. Day settled, and a few people drew closer. A cold crept into the air, even with sunlight warming my back. Sarah Finch from the Posey office had a smudge of dust on her cheek, looking like she was holding something back. The sky hung motionless over the church steeple, like a great sheet of tin. No clouds, no movement. Several people had already retreated inside while I finished folding collection plates. Whispers grew urgent and fragmented. Mr. Farr did not seem to be present. Cole claimed he'd seen a silver sliver before it vanished. Mrs. Lang insisted she'd kept her eyes down, afraid of a draft. Their accounts varied wildly. Some said the object appeared briefly. Others described it hanging for a long moment before sliding upward like a fish beneath water's surface. When I checked around the church tower, nothing seemed to miss, just the blue steeple and a thin strip of clouded sky. I studied the slate tiles, expecting some trace, a scorch mark or ash line, but found nothing. Yet something felt unsettled. The stories didn't align, as stories rarely do. Ruth Mason's cousin described a shadow like a bowl's interior. Mr. Cole swore it was circular and flat. The O'Neill siblings near the mill reported a mirror-like flash. A dozen perspectives, each claiming truth. Talk of cancelling the upcoming parish picnic ebbed and flowed like a tide. Reverend Jameson, who understood community dynamics, suggested they'd wait and see. His calm voice reassured everyone. Strange undercurrents lingered. They settled like dust, subtle yet pervasive. At home, I tried reading the ledger while Ellen kept the radio low. Farm reports and county updates played softly. I noticed an odd thin hiss when she adjusted the dial, like paper being roughly rubbed. The mantel clock gained and lost a minute. Our old terrier Roscoe seemed unsettled. Something hung in the air, undefined, yet unmistakable. I went back to the church alone one afternoon when the noon bells rang. The narrow stairs to the tower felt steep, leading to a small window overlooking Maine and the hedge. The air was thin, carrying hints of wet rope and old paint. Standing at the window, I pressed my forehead against the cool glass and looked out at the street below. At first, everything seemed ordinary. The butcher's boy swept the sidewalk. A child played with a hoop. A dog kept lifting and setting down its paw. I couldn't believe the sky had hosted something extraordinary, yet I couldn't dismiss the dozen honest faces who had told me otherwise. When I descended the stairs, the tower clock was 5 minutes off. The mantel clocks and downtown store clock each seemed to keep time with their own small differences. The world continues, and sometimes events pass without leaving a trace. That evening at dinner, Ellen asked what I thought it meant. I had no answer. I shared Reverend Jameson's advice about staying steady, and she said if the preacher remained calm, she could too. People kept talking. Some claimed it was a government device. Others suggested a traveling circus machine. A few whispered about messages from beyond. I don't know the truth. I only remember how it felt in the church when the lights dimmed and a strange hum rolled over us, like an unseen hand touching everything. The previous morning, the newspaper had reported curious events. A farmer 6 miles away noted his hens had gone silent at midday, and his son had seen a silver object graze the horizon above the church. A local man said his compass had wavered and then reset. At the grocery and co-op, people approached me with stories. Some described the church steeple's shadow moving oddly during morning bells. Others hadn't seen anything but trusted those who had. Some were angry such talk had entered the church. Some harbored a deeper fear they wouldn't discuss publicly. When I first heard the dog pacing against the back door, nails clicking like small questions, and then locked it, I flew out like someone closing a book midway through a page. None of these accounts proved anything. People always talk, but something had happened. The steeple stands bright and unchanged, a silent witness to what happened. When men walk past the churchyard, they still move with a slow, thoughtful shake of their heads, as if tracing invisible lines in the mind's ledger of memory. That day has faded into everyday talk, discussions of crops, weddings, and rail tickets. Every Sunday, I attend service and find myself watching the east window, waiting. My fingers trace the spine of the hookbook, seeking some kind of stability. In the quiet of the pew, strange sounds drift through my awareness. A faint, high note that seems to hover just beyond the town's edges like a ghostly string keeping time. I remember how faces turned upward that day, all looking in the same direction. Afterwards, we stood in the yard, each describing the moment slightly differently. A week passed, and conversations drifted to other topics. What can a person do when something inexplicable presses against the edges of daily life? Only continue living, listening, bearing witness to those moments that defy simple explanation. I apologize, but no text was provided for me to rewrite. Could you please share the original script or paragraph that you would like me to restructure?